Part 1. That's Hook. The rest stop looked empty at midnight. It wasn't. Special Agent Dara Voss had spent 11 weeks living inside a lie. Scrubs, a second-hand van, a laminated nursing badge from a hospital that didn't exist. She had tracked a human trafficking corridor running 400 miles through 3 counties, and tonight she was 40 minutes from the warehouse where the victims were being held. 40 minutes. Then 2 sheriff's deputies stepped out of the shadows, and everything changed. They weren't there to help her. They were there to stop her, because they were part of it, and they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. If this story grabs you from the first line, please subscribe to my channel and follow along until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The Silver Fork Travel Plaza sat at the junction of Route 9 and a county road that didn't appear on most GPS maps. That was deliberate. The plaza had been shuttered 18 months ago when the franchise that owned it lost its operating license over a grease fire that never quite made the papers. Now it existed in that particular American limbo. Parking lot cracked and weedy, the fluorescent lights inside still flickering on a timer no one had bothered to disable, bathrooms locked, vending machines dark. Truckers used the lot occasionally. Families pulled over to let kids run around. Nobody stayed long. That was also deliberate. Dara Voss pulled the white cargo van to a stop near the eastern edge of the lot, as far from the highway overpass as she could manage. She killed the headlights before she turned off the engine, and she sat in the dark for 60 seconds without moving, watching the mirrors. Habit. Not paranoia, just the kind of discipline that had kept her alive through 4 undercover assignments in 6 years. The van smelled like antiseptic and fast food wrappers, which was exactly right for a traveling contract nurse hauling supplies between rural health clinics. The supplies were real. The contracts were fabricated, backed by an FBI cover operation that had cost 3 months and a significant amount of interagency arguing to put together. She checked her watch. 11:52 p.m. She had a scheduled check-in with her handler, Agent Ren Calloway, at 12:15. That gave her 23 minutes to update her notes, run the audio file from the storage unit she'd visited that afternoon, and send a brief burst transmission on the encrypted device tucked inside a fake blood pressure cuff case in the back of the van. She reached for her thermos, found it empty, and tossed it onto the passenger seat with a dull plastic thud. Dara was 34 years old. She had brown hair she kept in a low ponytail, a face that most people found forgettable in the best possible way. The kind of face that didn't make you look twice in a waiting room or a grocery store. She was not short, not tall. She wore her scrubs the way nurses actually wore them, slightly wrinkled at the knees. A faded hospital logo on the chest from a real clinic she'd visited twice to study the layout. She had a smudge of what looked like medical tape residue on her left wrist. Her sneakers were a brand that hadn't been fashionable in 4 years. She looked, in other words, exactly like someone who didn't matter. That was the entire point. The case she'd been building for nearly 3 months centered on a trafficking network that had learned to use the infrastructure of legitimate healthcare to move people. Recruitment happened at clinics, shelters, transitional housing. The victims, mostly women between 17 and 35, several minors mixed in, were moved in vehicles that looked like medical transport. The paperwork was clean enough to pass a surface check. The network had survived 2 previous federal investigations because the people running it understood that the best camouflage was boredom. Nothing says "don't look twice" like a medical supply van at a highway rest stop. The network had a name inside the Bureau's files. Lantern. It had taken Dara's team 8 months just to confirm Lantern was real and not a rumor. Another 3 months to map even a partial route. The corridor she'd been tracking ran from Caldwell City in the southwest, through Harbor County, and terminated somewhere in the eastern end of Greylock Township, a cluster of semi-rural communities where the sheriff's department covered an area roughly the size of a small country and had a staffing level that meant some roads got patrolled maybe twice a week. Tonight's stop wasn't random. The storage facility she'd visited that afternoon had given her the piece she'd been missing, a destination address, a warehouse registered to a shell company called Meridian Cold Storage, 41 minutes east of where she was sitting. She had photographed the documents, transmitted the images to Calloway 3 hours ago, and received confirmation that a federal response team was being assembled. They needed 24 hours to position, maybe 36. She just had to hold her cover for one more day. She opened her laptop, pulled up her case notes in the encrypted partition, and started typing. She never heard the cruiser pull into the lot. The first indication she had that she wasn't alone was the beam of a spotlight washing across her driver's side mirror, so bright it blanched the entire interior of the van white. Dara's hand moved toward the space between her seat and the center console. An involuntary reflex stopped immediately. She was not carrying tonight. Carrying a weapon would break her cover if she was searched, and she had assessed the risk as low. She assessed a lot of things. She sat still. She arranged her face into something tired and slightly annoyed, the expression of someone who hadn't done anything wrong but also hadn't slept well in several days, which was true. The cruiser was a Harbor County Sheriff's Department vehicle. She could see the markings as the door swung open. One deputy got out from the driver's side, moving toward her with the particular swagger of someone who had decided something about her before he reached the window. A second deputy stayed near the passenger door of the cruiser, hand resting on his belt. Both men were in their mid-30s. She didn't recognize either of them from the case file photographs, which meant nothing because the network had more peripheral actors than the Bureau had identified. She rolled down her window before the first deputy reached it. Always do it before they ask. Don't make them feel like they had to demand something. "Evening," she said. The deputy looked at her, then at the van, then at her again. He had a broad face with a jaw that looked like it had been broken at some point and healed slightly wrong. His name tag read Coulter. "You aware this facility is closed?" "Yes, sir. I pulled in to check my route. I've got a delivery to make in Pinehurst by 7 a.m., and my GPS keeps trying to reroute me onto a road that's apparently been washed out." She gestured at the open laptop, trying to figure out the detour. Coulter looked at the laptop screen. It was displaying an actual map. Dara had pulled it up 3 seconds before he reached the window, which was why it was displaying an actual map. Medical supplies? He was reading the magnetic placard on the side of the van. Contract delivery. Harbor Regional Clinic. Consignment for the Pinehurst Satellite Office. She had documentation for all of it in a folder on the passenger seat. She didn't reach for it yet. Reaching without being asked made people nervous. "Can I see your license and registration?" She handed them over. Both were clean. The license was real. The registration supported by a cover company that had a real tax ID and a real business address in Caldwell City. She'd used this particular cover vehicle 11 times without issue. Coulter took the documents and walked back toward the cruiser. The second deputy, shorter, with a shaved head and eyes that moved constantly, not in a paranoid way but in the practiced way of someone who'd been trained to scan, drifted forward to the passenger side of the van and shone his flashlight through the window into the cargo area. Dara said nothing. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. "What's in the boxes?" the second deputy called out. "Medical supplies. Bandages. IV equipment. Some refrigerated biologics in the cooler on the left. I've got a manifest if you need to check it." She kept her voice level. Not overly cooperative, not defensive, just tired. "Pop the back." She hesitated. 2 seconds, exactly the length of time a real traveling nurse would hesitate before getting out of her van at midnight in a dark parking lot. Then she got out, went to the rear doors and opened them. The second deputy climbed halfway in. He moved boxes. He wasn't looking for medical supplies. His technique was wrong for that. He was checking corners, lifting things he'd have no reason to lift if he was just curious about the contents. He was looking for something specific, or someone specific. "You run this route often." Coulter had come back with her documents. He was standing close enough that she'd have to step back to look him in the face, which she didn't do. 3-4 times a month. Different routes? Depends on the clinic schedule. "You're out of Caldwell City?" "That's where the warehouse is, yes." "Long drive at this hour. That's why they pay the night differential." She smiled, just enough. Not too much. Too much made people wonder what you were covering. Coulter handed her documents back. He didn't step away. "You traveling alone?" "Always." She said it simply, without any edge to it, because a real nurse driving a medical supply van at midnight would not be threatened by that question. She would just answer it. "Seems like a lot for one person to handle." "It's not really. The boxes aren't that heavy." The second deputy dropped out of the back of the van. He gave Coulter a look that Dara caught and cataloged, a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, a slight tightening around the eyes, the small upward flick of a chin. It meant, not here, not here. As in, they'd been looking for something that should have been in this van, and it wasn't, or it meant something else. She wasn't certain yet, and uncertainty was the most dangerous state she could be in. "We're going to need you to come with us," Coulter said. Dara looked at him. She didn't move. "On what basis?" "Routine check. There's been some cargo theft in the area, medical supplies specifically. We need to run your paperwork through the county system." "My paperwork is clean. I've shown you my license, my registration, my—" "Ma'am." He put one hand on the van door, not touching her, but positioning himself so that if she moved to get back in, she'd have to go through him. "This'll take 20 minutes. You want to cooperate? We can have you back on the road before 1. She ran the calculation fast. Refusing created a scene. A scene could blow her cover. Going with them put her in a sheriff's station, potentially the worst possible location if any of those officers were connected to Lantern, which was now looking more likely than it had 60 seconds ago. But she had the burst transmitter, the encrypted device in the blood pressure case. If she could get a message to Calloway before they reached the station, she could have the situation flagged without destroying her cover. And 20 minutes in a county station wasn't catastrophic. She had the documentation to back up this identity 3 layers deep. "Fine," she said. "Let me lock up the van." She went around to the driver's side, leaned in like she was grabbing her keys, and in the 4 seconds she had with her body between her and the deputies, she pressed the emergency short code on the transmitter hidden in the door panel. One button. It sent a pre-configured status alert to Calloway's secondary device. It didn't say much. Location coordinates, timestamp, cover status, active. But it said she was at the Silver Fork lot and that she was moving. She locked the van, dropped the keys in her pocket, and followed Coulter to the cruiser. The drive to the Harbor County substation took 14 minutes. Dara counted the turns and memorized the road names. She sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window. The second deputy, whose name she still hadn't caught, rode up front and said nothing. Coulter drove. Nobody spoke. The substation was a converted commercial building on the edge of a small town called Graber's Mill. Population maybe 3,000, a water tower visible from the highway, 2 churches, a grain elevator, and a Dollar General. The building had been a hardware store once. You could still see the outline of the old sign beneath the painted-over facade. Inside it smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. There was a dispatcher behind a glass partition who glanced up when they came in and immediately looked back down at her screen. The second deputy took a seat at a desk near the back. Coulter gestured Dara toward a chair beside a table that held a community newspaper from 3 weeks ago and a coffee mug someone had abandoned. "Someone will be right with you," Coulter said, and walked through a door marked Staff Only. Dara sat. She counted the exits. Front door she'd come in through, the staff door Coulter had gone through, and a fire exit down a short hallway to her left. She looked at the dispatcher. The woman was in her 50s, heavy-set, with the kind of expression that had given up on being surprised a long time ago. She wasn't watching Dara. She was watching her computer screen with the focused blankness of someone managing a slow night. 7 minutes passed. Then a man came through the staff door. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a flannel shirt and dark jeans and work boots, and he moved like someone who owned the room even in civilian clothes. He was somewhere between 45 and 55, with a heavy build and pale gray eyes that were the most alert thing in his face. He pulled a chair around and sat down across from Dara, without introducing himself. "Sorry to drag you in at this hour," he said. He didn't sound sorry. "It's fine." She kept her tone cooperative. "I'd like to get back on the road as soon as possible, though. I've got a delivery commitment." "Sure." He leaned back. "Dara Voss. That your real name?" She had expected a lot of opening moves. She hadn't expected that one. She didn't let it show. "Yes. It's on my license." "I know it's on your license." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm asking if it's your real name." "I don't know what you mean by that." "I think you do." He folded his hands on the table. "You've been running this route for about 3 months. 3 months ago, there were no white cargo vans coming through this county at irregular hours. Now there's one, always the same plate, always a woman alone, always medical supplies. Never the same clinic twice. Different consignee every time." He paused. "I've been paying attention." "I work for multiple accounts," she said. "It's how contract delivery works." "What's the name of the blood pressure monitor company that made your case?" He said it the way someone says something they already know the answer to. Dara's pulse didn't change. Her expression didn't change. Her hands, visible on the table, didn't move. "Vital Core," she said, because that was what was printed on the case. "Vital Core went bankrupt 14 months ago. They don't manufacture anything anymore." He watched her. "But that's a real nice case." She said nothing. "Here's the thing," the man said. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table. "I don't think you're trying to steal from us. I think you're here because someone sent you to look at something, and I'd like to know who and why, because we have a community to protect here, and outside people poking around causes problems. I'm a contract nurse making a delivery." "You're very calm for someone being questioned at midnight." "I've been questioned before. Hospitals take paperwork seriously." He almost smiled. Almost. "I bet they do." He stood up. "You can wait here. Deputy Coulter will process your paperwork. If everything checks out, you'll be on your way." He walked back through the staff door. Dara counted to 15. Then she looked at the dispatcher, who was still not watching her. And she looked at the hallway toward the fire exit. And she looked at the camera mounted in the upper corner of the room pointing at the front door. It covered the entrance and the desk where the second deputy was sitting. It didn't cover the table where she was seated or the hallway. She did not move. Moving was not the right choice yet. What she did was think. The man in the flannel shirt was not a deputy. He hadn't identified himself. He'd known about the Vital Core bankruptcy, which meant he'd done enough research on her van to look up the equipment branding. That was not casual observation. That was surveillance, which meant they had been tracking her, at least partially, and they had either identified her cover or they were close to it. Close was not identified. Close still gave her room. Her phone was in her pocket. The cover phone, a prepaid with a real number and a call history she'd built over 3 months. The encrypted device was in the van. She had sent the burst alert 22 minutes ago. Calloway would have it by now. Whether Calloway would interpret a single status ping from a rest stop as urgent enough to trigger a response was a different question. She needed more time. She needed to stay in this room without doing anything that confirmed their suspicions. And she needed to figure out how much they actually knew, because the difference between "we think this van is suspicious" and "we know you're FBI" was the difference between an uncomfortable hour and a catastrophic operational failure. The second deputy got up from his desk and walked to the dispatcher's window. He said something through the glass. The dispatcher nodded, picked up her radio handset, and said something low that Dara couldn't make out. Then the dispatcher looked up, directly at Dara, for the first time since she'd come in. That was not a good sign. The second deputy came back around toward the table. He wasn't relaxed anymore. His shoulders were set differently, his jaw was tighter, and he was carrying a clear plastic evidence bag that he set down on the table in front of Dara without saying anything. Inside the bag was the blood pressure cuff case. They had gone back to the van. They had the transmitter. "Want to tell me what this is?" the deputy said. The case was intact, still sealed. If they'd opened it, they would have found what looked like a blood pressure monitor, because the transmitter was built into the casing of a real monitor, the only giveaway being a secondary port on the back panel that required specific knowledge to identify. She couldn't tell from where she was sitting whether they'd opened it or just transported it. "Blood pressure cuff," she said. "I keep it in the van in case a patient needs a quick reading during transport." "Where's the cuff?" "It should be in there with it. Did you open it?" He studied her. "Not yet." "Then you'll find the cuff inside," she said, because she knew the cuff was there. It was built into the assembly, part of the same housing as the transmitter. Any reasonably conducted search would produce a functional-looking blood pressure monitor. It wasn't foolproof, but it was good enough to survive a cursory inspection by someone who wasn't looking for signals intelligence. The deputy picked up the bag and walked back toward the staff door. Dara breathed in through her nose, slowly, out through her mouth. The air in the room tasted like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner, and the particular staleness of a building that was used mostly at night. 4 minutes later, the man in the flannel shirt came back. He was carrying the case. He set it on the table, opened it, and placed the blood pressure monitor on the table between them. He turned it over in his hands with the deliberate calm of someone who was not in a hurry. He pressed the power button. The monitor beeped once, and the display lit up. Vital Core 3000. Battery, 60%. He wrapped the cuff around his own forearm, pressed start. He was watching her face the entire time the monitor inflated. The reading appeared, 128/81. He unwrapped the cuff and set the monitor down. "Works," he said. "Yes," she said. He turned it over. He was looking at the back panel. Dara watched his fingers and his eyes, and she kept her own face in the expression of mild, tired boredom she'd been maintaining for the past 45 minutes. His thumb found the secondary port. "What's this connection for?" "Printer output. Some of the older clinic models use a wired printer for patient records. Most places have gone digital, but some of the rural offices still run the older systems." He looked at the port for 3 more seconds. Then he set the monitor back in the case, closed it, and pushed it across the table. "You can have that back," he said. He stood up, and for a moment he was very still, the way people get still when they've made a decision they're not entirely comfortable with. "Deputy Coulter is going to need a little more time with your paperwork. There's a vending machine in the hall. It takes cards. Help yourself." He left. Dara sat with the case in front of her and understood 2 things simultaneously. First, that she had passed whatever test that was, at least provisionally. Second, that she was not going to be allowed to leave anytime soon, and the reason had nothing to do with paperwork. She had been here almost an hour. Calloway would have flagged her status by now. The response would be measured, careful. Calloway was not the kind of handler who panicked at a single burst transmission. He would be tracking her location through the cover phone's passive signal, and he would be deciding whether to call in a welfare check disguised as a routine contact or wait for her next scheduled check-in. Wait, probably. Calloway always waited. It was his best quality and his most frustrating one. She needed to find out what was in this building, not for her own curiosity. She needed to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. Whether these were peripheral actors who'd noticed a suspicious van, or whether she had driven herself directly into the operational center of Lantern's county infrastructure. She stood up, took the case, and walked toward the hallway with the vending machines. She walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd been given permission to use the hallway, which she had, technically. The dispatcher was watching her phone now. The second deputy's desk was empty. The hallway was narrow, 2 doors on the left, 1 on the right. The fire exit at the end. The vending machine was between the 2 left-hand doors, just as he'd said. She stopped in front of it and fed her card in and bought a bottle of water because buying something was the reason she was in the hallway, and she needed the reason to be real. She listened. From behind the first left-hand door, nothing. From behind the second, the low sound of voices. 2 of them, maybe 3, too muffled to make out words. A radio turned down low, something that sounded like a printer running. The door on the right was slightly ajar. She didn't look at it directly. She used her peripheral vision as she turned back toward the main room, water bottle in hand, and in the 3 seconds she had angled toward the door, she saw enough. Filing boxes. A folding table with a laptop. On the wall, a printed map of Harbor County with several locations marked in red marker. She didn't have time to read the specific labels, but she didn't need to. She'd spent 3 months staring at a version of that same map. She knew the shape of that corridor the way she knew her own handwriting. One of the red marks was on the eastern edge of Greylock Township, the same location as Meridian Cold Storage. She walked back to her chair and sat down, water bottle unopened in her hand, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she was not dealing with deputies who'd noticed something suspicious. She was sitting inside the infrastructure of the thing she had been hunting for 11 weeks. These men didn't work for Lantern. They were Lantern, or a significant part of it, operating out of a substation that gave them law enforcement authority, radio access, and legal cover for anything they wanted to move through this county at night, which meant Coulter and the second deputy hadn't pulled her over because she looked suspicious. They'd pulled her over because they already knew who she was, or they knew enough that they were trying to confirm it. She set the water bottle on the table. She thought about the 41 minutes between this building and the warehouse. She thought about the victims documented in the case file, names and photographs she had memorized because that was the work. She thought about Calloway's voice on the phone 3 days ago, clipped and careful. "We're getting close. Don't push it." She thought about the map on the wall with the red marks, about the printer running behind that closed door. Then the lights in the building went off. Not dimmed, off, completely, instantly, as though someone had thrown a breaker. The emergency strip lighting in the hallway kicked on a second later, red-orange and low, throwing shadows that pointed in all the wrong directions. The dispatcher made a sharp sound behind her glass partition. From somewhere in the building, the man in the flannel shirt's voice carried through a wall, flat, precise, giving an instruction she couldn't quite hear. Dara was on her feet before the emergency lights had fully engaged. The second deputy came through the staff door at a run. He was not heading for the hallway or the dispatcher or the front entrance. He was heading directly for her, and his hand was no longer resting casually on his belt. Part 2. He came at her fast, and she let him get close. That was the counterintuitive thing about the training. Every instinct said create distance, but distance gave the other person time to read your intentions, and right now her intentions needed to stay invisible for another 3 seconds. She waited until he was close enough that she could smell the synthetic fabric of his uniform, and then she stepped hard to her left, using the momentum he'd already committed to, and the second deputy hit the edge of the table with his hip instead of his hands, and the impact knocked the water bottle and the blood pressure case onto the floor. She was already moving toward the hallway. Not the front door. The front door was lit by the emergency strips, visible from the parking lot, and she didn't know who was outside. The fire exit at the end of the hallway. She moved fast without running, because running was noise and noise was information she didn't want to give them yet. She heard the deputy behind her swear, recover, come after her. The fire exit bar hit hard under her palms and the door swung open into a narrow loading area behind the building. Gravel, a dumpster, the back end of a utility truck, chain link fence maybe 30 feet out. The alarm that should have triggered on the emergency exit didn't, which meant the building's secondary systems were offline, which was consistent with the main breaker having been thrown deliberately, which meant this was a planned escalation, not a mechanical failure. She crossed the gravel at a run, hit the chain link, went over it in 4 seconds. Not clean, she caught her left sleeve on the top rail and it tore, which was fine, and dropped down on the other side onto a strip of gravel and weeds that ran along the back of a row of commercial units, most of them dark, one of them with a light on in the back. She moved along the building line, using the shadow, and pulled her cover phone from her pocket. No signal. 1 bar, then none. Rural dead zone, or someone in that building was running a jammer. If they had a jammer, this was more sophisticated than a county substation operation improvised around a suspicious van. She kept moving. The town of Graber's Mill was small enough that she could orient herself from the water tower, which was visible above the roofline to her north. The highway was east. The Silver Fork lot, where her van was north-northeast, roughly 1.5 miles. She had no weapon, no functioning communication, a torn sleeve, and gravel in her left shoe from the landing. Her case notes, the laptop, and the encrypted transmitter were in the van. She needed the van. She also needed to not walk directly into whoever Coulter had called ahead to wait at it. She moved through the back lots, taking the long way, and she thought about what she'd seen in that room. The map, the red marks, the printer running at midnight in a building that was supposed to be handling routine county paperwork. She thought about the man in the flannel shirt who'd known the Vital Core bankruptcy date, who had handled the blood pressure monitor with the specific deliberateness of someone who'd been briefed on what to look for. He was not a sheriff's deputy. He was not administrative staff. He was someone who had operational knowledge of what lantern was moving and where. And he was operating out of this building with the apparent cooperation of at least 2 uniformed officers. The scope of that was something she would think about later. Right now, she was thinking about a fence line and a water tower and 1.5 miles of dark roads. She found a gap between 2 buildings that gave her a view of the main street. Empty. The substation was visible 2 blocks down, its exterior lights still on. Exterior circuits on a different breaker than the interior, apparently. She could see Coulter's cruiser parked in front, and a second vehicle she hadn't noticed before, a black pickup truck with a county utilities decal on the door, which was not a county utilities truck. She pulled back from the gap and moved north, paralleling the main street without touching it. 14 minutes of careful movement. A dog barked from behind a fence for about half that. She navigated around a parking lot, through the back of what had been a grain cooperative, and came out on the county road that ran north toward the highway. She was cold. The scrubs weren't made for this, and the night temperature had dropped into the low 50s while she was sitting in that building being assessed by a man who'd done his homework. She found a gap in the tree line along the road's shoulder and stayed inside it, walking parallel to the road rather than on it. Her left hand was bleeding. She'd caught it on the chain link and hadn't noticed until she felt the warmth on her fingers. It wasn't deep, but it was persistent, and she pressed the torn edge of her sleeve against it and kept walking. She was thinking about Ren Calloway and whether he'd gotten the burst alert and what he'd done with it. And she was thinking about the warehouse 41 minutes east. And she was thinking about the names in the case file. She did this deliberately when the situation was bad enough that she needed to anchor herself to something real. Not the paperwork of the investigation, the faces. The photographs pulled from missing persons databases, from family submissions, from shelter intake records. 17 confirmed likely victims, 4 of them minors. Those were just the ones they'd been able to connect to this specific corridor. The actual number was probably higher, and she knew that, and she kept walking. The Silver Fork Travel Plaza appeared in the distance as a smear of light from the remaining overhead fixtures still running on timer. Her van was where she'd left it. From this distance, she could see the parking lot was empty. No cruisers, no vehicles. Either they'd pulled surveillance back, which made no sense, or they hadn't yet positioned anyone here because they'd assumed she was contained in the substation, which meant she had a window. She broke from the tree line and crossed the highway approach at a jog, staying low and angled, and reached the van on the passenger side. She tried the door, still locked. She pulled her keys. They hadn't taken her keys, which was either an oversight or confirmation that they'd expected to keep her at the station. And she got in from the passenger side and climbed across to the driver's seat and sat low. She took 30 seconds. Then she reached under the driver's seat, past the emergency kit, and pulled out the secondary transmitter she'd told no one about. Not Calloway, not the case supervisor, not the technical team that had built the blood pressure monitor housing. This one was her personal modification, a small flat device the size of a credit card, built into the base layer of the seat cushion, which she'd installed herself in month 2 when she started feeling like the corridor was more organized than the Bureau's threat assessment suggested. It was not Bureau-issued equipment. It used a commercial encrypted frequency, military adjacent but not classified, and it would reach a satellite relay if she got a clean signal and held it for 45 seconds. She held it for 45 seconds. She didn't know for certain that anyone would pick it up. She'd registered the device's ID with one person, a former Army signals officer named Bet Marsh, who now worked contract communications consulting and had owed Dara a significant favor since 2019. Bet monitored the frequency as a professional courtesy, which was a polite way of saying she monitored it because she knew the kind of work Dara did and she paid attention. Whether Bet was awake at 12:47 in the morning and whether she had her equipment running was not something Dara could control. She set the transmitter on the passenger seat, started the van, and drove east. She was not going back to wait. She understood this was a deviation from protocol. She understood that protocol existed for reasons and that deviating from it had consequences. And she accepted all of that with the same clarity she'd applied to everything else in the last 2 hours. The response team Calloway was assembling needed 24 hours to position. She did not have 24 hours. She had a location, a set of operational observations that significantly updated her threat picture, and the knowledge that Coulter and the man in the flannel shirt were going to realize within the next 20 to 30 minutes that she was not coming back through that fire exit. When that happened, they would move, and the first thing they would move was whatever was at Meridian Cold Storage. She drove east on Route 9 with her headlights on and her hands steady on the wheel. 31 minutes to the warehouse. She used the time. She reconstructed everything she'd observed in the substation and ran it against what the case file had established. Lantern operated through legitimate infrastructure, medical transport for recruitment and movement, law enforcement authority for suppression and route security. The substation in Graber's Mill was a node, not the head. There was always a head, someone with access to the logistics layer who made decisions about timing and routes and which victims went where. The man in the flannel shirt had that knowledge, but probably wasn't the head either. He was an operator, a fixer, the kind of person who managed problems before they became visible. She had been a problem he'd tried to manage. She was about to become a different kind of problem. The road east was nearly empty, 2 trucks heading west, a farm vehicle parked on a side road with its hazards on, nothing else. She drove 3 miles under the speed limit and watched her mirrors. No one was following her or no one she could detect. She kept the transmitter on the passenger seat with the indicator light blinking once every 8 seconds, which meant it was still trying to reach the relay. At the 22-minute mark, the light changed from intermittent to steady. Contact. She didn't pull over. She drove with one hand and held the transmitter with the other and spoke quietly and precisely for 90 seconds.
giving Bet Marsh everything she had: the substation location, the flannel shirt man, the map, the red marks, the Meridian cold storage address, the number of individuals she'd observed at the substation. She said the word lantern twice and the word active once, and then she set the transmitter back on the seat. Whether Bet could or would do anything with that information was outside Dara's control. But the information was now outside the building in Graber's Mill, and that mattered.
8 minutes later, a road sign confirmed she was in Greylock Township. Meridian Cold Storage appeared on her left 4 minutes after that. It was larger than she'd expected from the Shell Company registration. The facility occupied what had been a commercial distribution center, a main building of maybe 20,000 square feet, concrete block construction, loading dock on the south side with 4 bays, a smaller adjacent structure that might have been offices or refrigerated storage. The whole property was surrounded by a chain-link perimeter fence, 8 feet, with a single gate on the road frontage that was currently closed but not visibly locked. The parking area inside the fence held 2 box trucks, a panel van, and a pickup truck she did not recognize. There were lights on inside the main building. Dara drove past without slowing down. She went another quarter-mile up the road, found a field access track that ran behind a stand of trees, and pulled the van in far enough that it wasn't visible from the road. She got out. She went to the back of the van and opened the case that held her actual nursing supplies, moved 3 boxes aside, and found the false panel. Inside it were the things she'd carried for 11 weeks without using: a tactical flashlight, a compact set of entry tools she was technically not supposed to have, a foldable glass breaker with a belt clip, a trauma kit, a thermal hood, and under the trauma kit, in a padded sleeve, her actual credentials, her real badge, her real ID. She held the badge in her hand for a moment. Using it meant the cover was gone. The cover had probably been gone from the moment the man in the flannel shirt said her name with that particular inflection. She clipped the badge to the inside of her scrubs top, took the flashlight and the entry tools, and walked back down the tree line toward the fence. The gate was chained, but the chain was loose. A lock she would have needed the entry tools for, but someone had left the chain simply looped through the links rather than secured, which suggested the gate had been opened recently, and whoever had opened it expected to leave again soon. She lifted the chain off and went through. She moved along the inside of the fence, keeping the main building between herself and the loading dock. The smaller structure had a single door on the side facing her, solid metal with a push-bar handle. She tried it, locked. She used the entry tools, which took 90 seconds because the lock was a commercial grade she'd practiced on, but not recently, and then the door opened. Inside was not office space. It was a holding area. The room was maybe 60 feet by 40, concrete floor, drop ceiling with fluorescent fixtures. Several of them burned out, the rest creating a patchy, sickly light. Along the right-hand wall, a row of what had been industrial shelving units, stripped down and converted into partitioned spaces using plywood and zip ties. Each partition was approximately the size of a large closet. Some of them had sleeping bags. Some of them had people. Dara stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust and counted. 11 people that she could see, probably more in the partitions at the back. The room smelled like a space that hadn't been properly ventilated in days. Sweat and stress, and the particular stillness of people who had learned not to make noise. She kept her voice low and even. "Federal agent, I'm not here to hurt you. I need everyone to stay quiet and stay where you are for right now." Several faces turned toward her. A woman near the front partition, maybe 25, with a bruise on her jaw that had gone from purple to green at the edges. Older injury, several days at least, looked at Dara with an expression that was not relief and not fear exactly, but something in between, the look of someone who had been lied to before by people who said helpful things and was calibrating whether to believe it again. "Are there guards in the building?" Dara asked, directing the question at the woman. The woman glanced toward the door on the far end of the room, a door that connected to the main warehouse structure. Then she held up 2 fingers. 2 guards. Inside. "How long ago did you last see them?" The woman tilted her head, calculating. "Hour," she said. Her accent was mixed, hard to place. "Maybe more." "Do they have a routine? Do they come through this room on a schedule?" "Every 2 hours. Sometimes less." Dara looked at the connecting door. It was solid, no window, no sound coming through right now. "Is there anyone who needs immediate medical attention?" The woman shook her head no, then glanced toward the far back of the room and wavered. "Show me." At the back partition, lying on a sleeping bag, was a girl who couldn't have been older than 16. She was conscious, but barely, eyes half open, face flushed, breathing in the shallow, rapid rhythm of someone running a significant fever. Dara crouched beside her, pressed the back of her hand to the girl's forehead, then her neck. Temperature high enough to be dangerous, pulse too fast. The girl's left ankle was wrapped in what looked like strips of someone's shirt. What happened to her ankle? "She tried to run," the woman said simply, as though this required no further explanation, because it didn't. Dara opened her jacket and looked at the trauma kit on her belt. She didn't have antibiotics. The supplies in her van were real nursing supplies, but not a full field kit. She had wound care, basic medications, an EpiPen she'd never needed to use. She had ibuprofen, which wouldn't fix this but might lower the fever enough to matter. She administered it, got the girl to swallow with a small amount of water from her own bottle, and stood up. "I'm going to come back with help," she said. She looked at the woman. "I need to deal with what's on the other side of that door first. How many people total in this room?" The woman counted silently. 14. 14. The case file had estimated 17. Some were already moved then, or the file had missed some, or some were in the main building. Any of those options was bad. "I need you to keep everyone calm and quiet until I come back. Can you do that?" The woman looked at her with that same calibrated, guarded expression. Then she nodded once. Not warmly. Practically. Dara went to the connecting door. She put her ear against it. Faint voices. One, maybe two, not heated. The bored murmur of people doing a long shift in a building. The sound of something scraping on a concrete floor, like a chair being pushed back. Then quiet. She gave it 3 minutes. Then she tried the door. It wasn't locked on her side. The warehouse was large and largely empty. Cleared industrial space. The kind that had held racking systems at some point. Floor mount brackets still visible. At the far end near the loading dock, 2 men were seated at a card table with a portable heater between them. They were playing cards, which struck her as almost surreal given the context. But people who did this kind of work still had to fill hours, and this was how they filled them. One had a radio on the table. One had a handgun in a shoulder holster. Both were in civilian clothes. She was 60 feet away and had no weapon and no backup. She stepped back through the door into the holding area and pulled it almost closed. What she had was the element of surprise, their complacency, and approximately 45 seconds before she had to commit to whatever she was going to do. She was not going to wait for backup that wasn't confirmed to be coming. The girl in the back partition had a fever that was going to cross into crisis territory within hours. Whoever had ordered this operation to be packaged up and moved was somewhere between a substation in Graber's Mill and this building, and they were going to call those men's radio within the next 30 minutes. She took her badge out from inside her scrubs top and held it in her left hand. She picked up the flashlight in her right. She went back through the door. She walked toward them at a steady pace, directly, no hesitation, and she got within 20 feet before the one facing her looked up from his cards. "Federal agent." She held the badge high and kept walking. "Hands on the table. Both of you." The one facing her reacted slowly. The freeze that precedes a decision, not the compliance she needed. The one with his back to her started to turn, hand moving toward the shoulder holster. "Don't," she said. Flat, not loud. He turned anyway. So she closed the last 12 feet at a run and used the flashlight. It was not clean. She'd had cleaner moments in training. His elbow came up and deflected part of it, and she caught the edge of his forearm instead of his wrist, which meant he kept the grip on the weapon longer than she needed him to, and they went sideways into the card table, and the table collapsed and the radio bounced off the concrete floor and skittered 6 feet. She got 2 hands on his gun hand, wrist lock, and leveraged it until he made the sound people make when a joint is being pushed past its preferred direction and the gun came loose. The first man had stood up. He had not gone for a weapon. She noted that, filed it, and he was backing away from the table with his hands partway up, not fully, the way you put your hands up when you're not sure yet what the situation is. "Get on the floor," she said. She had the weapon. She kept it on the man who'd gone for his holster. He was on one knee, holding his wrist, breathing hard. "Both of you. Floor, hands behind your heads. Do it now." They did it. She used zip ties from her trauma kit for the wrists, which was not ideal but functional, and she used the electrical cable from the portable heater for the ankles because she only had 2 zip ties and 2 men. She took the radio and the holstered weapon and the phone she found in the first man's jacket pocket. She was breathing harder than she wanted to admit. Her left hand was still bleeding. She had a bruise developing on her right forearm where his elbow had connected. The radio crackled. She listened. A voice she didn't recognize said a sequence of numbers, then, "Confirm your status." Then silence. Then the numbers again. She didn't respond. She looked at the man on the floor who'd had the radio on the table, because he was the one who would know what that call meant. "What's the response code?" she asked. He said nothing. "They're going to know something's wrong in about 2 minutes regardless," she said. "The response code buys me time. It might also matter for how things go for you when federal investigators get here, which they will." He looked at the floor. She was out of time for persuasion. She lifted the radio, pressed the transmit button, and said the number sequence back in a register as close to neutral as she could manage. Silence on the other end for 4 seconds. Then, "Copy." She let out a breath. She went back to the holding area. The woman was standing now, the same watchful expression, several others awake and watching. Dara held up the badge. "I've secured the guards. I need everyone to move toward the side door in an orderly way. We're going outside and moving to the north side of the fence. Stay low. Stay together. No phones." She looked around the room. "Anyone who can walk, please help anyone who can't. We move in 60 seconds. The woman didn't hesitate this time. She turned and started speaking quietly to the others, and the room began to move. Dara went back to the far partition and crouched beside the sick girl. "I'm going to carry you. Is that okay?" The girl looked at her with half-focused eyes, said nothing, then gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Dara lifted her, adjusted her weight, and started for the door. They were halfway across the lot, 14 people moving through the dark in a ragged line with Dara at the back carrying the girl, when the headlights appeared at the gate. Not one vehicle. 3. The gate was already open. She'd left it open. And the vehicles came through without stopping, and their headlights swept across the lot and caught the group in full. For a moment, everything was lit up and completely visible. 14 people from the holding area, a federal agent carrying a sick teenager, all of them in the middle of a chain-link enclosed property with nowhere to go. The lead vehicle stopped 30 feet away. The driver's door opened, and the man in the flannel shirt stepped out into the headlights. He looked at the scene in front of him. He looked at Dara. He looked at the badge she was still holding in her left hand above the girl's shoulder. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached back into the vehicle and came out with a rifle. "You're not going anywhere," he said. His voice was exactly as calm as it had been in the substation. "Put her down. Put the badge down." And everybody stepped back toward the building. The 14 people behind Dara had gone absolutely still. The girl in her arms shifted, feverish and half-conscious, and made a small sound. Dara looked at the rifle, at the man holding it, at the 2 other vehicles whose doors had not yet opened. She shifted the girl's weight to her right arm, and she pressed the transmitter in her left hand, the flat commercial device she'd carried since month 2. 1 button, hard, 3 times. The emergency pulse. The one that didn't need a relay because it went direct to the nearest available receiver on the frequency, and she didn't know if Bet Marsh was the nearest available receiver or if anyone was, but she pressed it because it was the only card she had left, and she'd rather play it into empty air than not play it at all. The man in the flannel shirt watched her hand. "What did you just do?" he asked. She looked at him. "What I should have done an hour ago." Part 3. The man in the flannel shirt held the rifle level and didn't answer her right away. That was information. People who were fully in control answered immediately. They didn't need to think because thinking meant calculating, and calculating meant something had shifted in the equation. Something had shifted. Dara held the girl against her right side and kept her left hand visible with the transmitter. She didn't move toward him, and she didn't move back. She stood in the middle of the lot with the headlights of 3 vehicles turning everything flat and shadowless, and she watched his face and waited. "You're bluffing," he said finally. "I'm not, and you know I'm not." She kept her voice at conversational volume, loud enough to carry to the people in the other vehicles, because those people mattered too. "You identified me 3 hours ago. You know I'm operational, which means you know my handler has my location and is monitoring my status. And the last transmission I sent before I walked into your station told him where I was going. This was partially true. She had sent a burst alert with her location. She had not told Calloway she was driving to Meridian Cold Storage, because she hadn't known yet when she'd sent it. But the man in the flannel shirt didn't know the precise content of what she'd transmitted, and the gap between what he knew and what he feared was the only leverage she currently had. "You came out here alone," he said. "No backup vehicle, no team. If your people were coming, they'd be here. They're 24 hours out. That's standard staging for a response this size. But you've been in this long enough to know what happens when an agent in the field goes dark." He shifted his weight. Not much. Barely a quarter step. But she saw it. Behind her, she could hear the 14 people breathing. Someone was crying quietly, a sound they were clearly trying to suppress, small, ragged inhales. The girl in her arms had gone heavier, the particular dead weight of someone who'd slipped toward unconsciousness. Dara adjusted her grip without looking down. One of the other vehicle doors opened. Coulter got out. He walked to where the flannel shirt man was standing, and they exchanged 4 words she couldn't hear. Then Coulter looked at her, and his expression was not the aggressive performance it had been at the rest stop. He looked like a man who was deciding something difficult, which was worse. "You need to put the girl down," Coulter said. "She has a fever of at least 103. She needs IV fluids and a broad-spectrum antibiotic within the next several hours, or she goes septic. I'm not putting her down in a parking lot." "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "That's not something I can control right now." "Then find me something to control it with. You have a vehicle with a first aid kit. Get it." He blinked. The request was so practical it seemed to catch him off guard. The flannel shirt man said quietly, "Nolan." Coulter, who was apparently Nolan, a first name she hadn't had until now, looked at him. "We're not doing that," the flannel shirt man said. "She's going to die if she—" "I said we're not doing that." Not loud. Just final. Coulter shut his mouth, but his jaw worked for a moment after, and that was something. Dara filed it away. The flannel shirt man looked at her again. "We're going to walk this back. You're going to come with us. These people are going to go back inside, and in the morning, there's going to be a federal inquiry that goes absolutely nowhere, because there's nothing here, legally speaking, that connects to anything actionable. You'd know that if you'd seen our documentation." "I've seen your map," she said. A pause. "What map?" "The one in the room off the hallway at your substation. Red marks. Eastern Greylock. This address." She watched him. "I've also transmitted that information, so the map existing in your building is already part of a federal record whether or not I walk out of this lot." The rifle didn't move, but his hands tightened on it. "You're making this worse," he said. "I'm making it accurate," she said. "There's a difference." 30 seconds of silence. The portable heater from the warehouse was still running somewhere inside when she could faintly hear it, and somewhere beyond the fence a truck moved on the highway, its sound fading east. The girl in her arms breathed in shallow pulls. Then Dara heard something else. It was faint at first, a low-frequency vibration more felt than heard, coming from the north. She knew that sound. She'd spent enough time adjacent to military operations to know it before it resolved into anything recognizable. Rotor wash. The flannel shirt man heard it too. His head came up. The helicopter appeared over the tree line to the northwest, running without visible lights for the first 2 seconds, and then its searchlight activated and swept across the property in a single smooth arc that caught all 3 vehicles, the fence line, and the group of people in the middle of the lot in one continuous motion. It was a civilian-configured aircraft, not military, but moving with the decisiveness of something directed, not wandering. A voice came from a speaker system aboard, clear even over the rotor noise. "This is a federal law enforcement operation. All individuals on this property, put down your weapons and put your hands where they can be seen." The flannel shirt man did not put down the rifle immediately. He looked at the helicopter, then at Dara, and in his face she saw the specific collapse of a plan. Not panic, but the controlled internal reckoning of someone calculating what version of this they could still survive. "Bet Marsh," Dara said quietly. Just to him. He didn't know the name. That was clear from his face. He had no Beta Marsh in his network, which meant the signals she'd sent had found someone entirely outside his operational map. He'd thought he had the county locked down. He'd thought he knew every communication channel she might use. He hadn't known about a contract signals officer monitoring a commercial frequency from a home office in another state.
He lowered the rifle. Not all the way, not fast. A slow, considered drop until the barrel pointed at the ground. Coulter's hands were already up. The third vehicle, which had not opened its doors, started its engine. It tried to back toward the gate. The helicopter's searchlight followed it and held. A second light source appeared at the gate. Vehicle headlights, 2 sets, coming in from the road. Not moving fast, but moving with the particular purposeful spacing of vehicles that knew where they were going. Dara shifted the girl's weight and walked toward the side of the lot, away from the vehicles, and set the girl down gently against the fence base, kneeling beside her. She pulled off her scrubs jacket and folded it under the girl's head. The girl's eyes were closed now, her breathing audible, her skin still radiantly hot to the touch. "Stay with me," Dara said, not because the girl could likely hear her, but because she needed to say it. She stood back up as the vehicles came through the gate. The first was a black SUV. The second was a white panel van. Not hers, a different one, with federal plates. 4 people got out of the SUV. 2 in tactical gear with federal agent printed on the back. 1 in a suit carrying a case. 1 who was not in any of those categories, but who Dara recognized immediately, despite not having seen him in person in 4 months. Ren Calloway was 51 years old and built like someone who had played football in his 20s, and then spent 20 years doing something that didn't involve football, but required a similar tolerance for sustained discomfort. He was wearing a jacket over a button-down, which meant he'd gotten the alert in the middle of his night, and had dressed in the order that made operational sense rather than social sense. He looked at the lot, at the helicopter, at the vehicles, at the 14 people, and then at Dara. His expression cycled through something she chose not to examine too closely. "You drove to the warehouse," he said. "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." "You secured 2 armed guards, removed 14 victims from a holding facility, and called in air support using a device I didn't know you had. The device is registered commercially. I can document it." He looked at her for another moment. "You're bleeding." "I know." "Okay." He turned to the tactical team. "Secure the site, start processing the individuals. I want the guards' communications pulled before anything else. I need to know who they contacted in the last 3 hours." Then he turned to the woman in the suit who had the case. "Dr. Ferris, there's a minor at the fence line with a high fever, possible ankle fracture, needs immediate assessment." The woman with the case was already moving before he finished the sentence. Calloway turned back to Dara. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the flannel shirt man, who was now being walked toward the second SUV by one of the tactical agents, wrists bound behind him with a zip strip. He looked at Coulter, already in the back of the first SUV. He looked at the third vehicle, whose driver had given up on the gate and was standing outside it with both hands on the roof at the instruction of the second tactical agent. "The man in the blue jacket," Dara said. "He's the operational lead. He had access to the full route map. He knew my identity or close to it, and he was operating out of the Harbor County substation with at least 2 uniformed deputies. We'll pull his ID. He knew the Vital Corps bankruptcy date off the top of his head. He's been tracking this corridor for a while. He's not a recent recruit." Calloway nodded. He was writing in a small notebook, which was a habit she'd always found slightly anachronistic and also completely reliable. "The substation in Graber's Mill? Full search. The room off the main hallway, there's a laptop and a county map with route markers. The map alone is going to be significant." She paused. "There's also a deputy named Nolan Coulter who I think is reachable. He balked when the man in the jacket refused to get medical supplies for the girl. It's a small thing, but small things, they add up." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. "You want to tell me about the commercial transmitter?" "Not right now." "Later then." "Sure." He closed the notebook. "Go get your hand looked at." She didn't move immediately. She looked at the fence line where Dr. Ferris was crouched beside the girl, her case open, a portable IV line already being prepared. She looked at the other 13 people, who were being approached by the remaining agents with water and emergency thermal blankets, and the way some of them moved toward the agents and some of them didn't, and how the woman with the bruise on her jaw stood apart from both groups and watched everything with the same careful calculation she'd applied to Dara in the holding area. There was still something wrong. She could feel it. Not a specific thing she could point to,
but the particular professional unease of someone who has solved the presented problem and keeps feeling like a version of the problem they haven't seen yet is still running. "Ren," she said. He'd started to turn away. He stopped. The case file had 17 estimated victims on this corridor. I counted 14 in the holding area. 3 are unaccounted for. He was quiet for a moment. They could have been moved before tonight. Or they're still in the main building. She looked at the warehouse. The guards were at the loading dock end. I didn't go through the full structure. He turned to the tactical team lead, a woman named Sorrel, who had the clipped economy of movement that came from a lot of entries in a lot of buildings. "Ferris takes the miner to the transport. Your team clears the main structure, full sweep, starting from the loading dock inward." Sorrel nodded, already moving. Dara went with her. Calloway didn't tell her not to. He also didn't tell her to go get her hand looked at again, which she appreciated. The main building was cold, refrigerated storage on the right half, the temperature dropping noticeably as they moved through the loading dock section. Sorrel had 2 agents on point, moving properly, and Dara stayed back and to the left and let them work. Her role here was recognition, not entry. She'd been inside Lantern's operational world for 3 months, and she could identify relevant documentation and physical evidence faster than a fresh team, and that was what she was here for. The first 2 sections were empty. Old equipment, some pallets, nothing that shouldn't be in a commercial cold storage facility on paper. But at the back of the refrigerated section, behind a false wall of stacked industrial shelving units, the kind of setup that was obvious once you knew to look for it, because no functional cold storage facility arranged its shelving at that angle relative to the loading equipment. Sorrel's point agent found the secondary room. It was smaller than the holding area, maybe 20 by 20. No sleeping bags, just a concrete floor and 4 people huddled against the far wall, 2 adults and 2 children, all of them in the particular stillness of people who have been very quiet for a very long time and are now unsure whether the new sounds mean something better or something worse. One of the children was maybe 8 years old. Dara crouched down to be at eye level with the smaller one. She held up her badge, not aggressively, just so it was visible. "You're safe," she said. She said it the way you say something that you know isn't the whole truth and isn't a lie either. They were physically safer than they had been 30 minutes ago, and anything beyond that was going to take time she wasn't in a position to promise. The child looked at the badge, then at Dara's face, then at the torn scrub sleeve and the dried blood on her hand. "Are you a nurse?" the child asked. Dara looked at the badge, then back at the child. "Something like that," she said. She stayed there while Sorrel coordinated the transport protocols, and she talked to all 4 of them in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular. The drive to the hospital, what it would look like, who would be there, because that was what you did when people had been in a small, cold room for an unknown number of hours, and the only thing that cost nothing was keeping your voice calm. 40 minutes later, both groups of victims were in the transport vehicles. The federal medical team had the girl on an IV, temperature being actively managed. Dr. Ferris had assessed the ankle as a significant sprain with possible small fracture. Not an emergency, but real. The older woman with a bruise on her jaw was in the second transport, and she'd looked at Dara more time before she got in, and what she'd said was not thank you. She'd said, "There are more places." Dara had stopped. "What do you mean?" "This isn't the only one. The men here, they talked at night because they didn't think we understood English. Some of us did." She said it flatly. Not for effect, just as information she was passing along because it was relevant. "There are 3 places on this route. This was the middle one. 3 locations. The case file had identified 1 confirmed site and 2 suspected. Meridian was the confirmed." Dara looked at the transport vehicle and then at Calloway, who was 15 feet away and had clearly heard the exchange. He was already on his phone. She turned back to the woman. "The other 2 places, did you hear anything about where? Any road names, any landmarks, anything they mentioned?" The woman thought. This was someone who had spent days listening and cataloging, doing exactly what Dara had been doing in the substation, gathering information in a constrained environment and sorting it for what might be useful. One of them, the first place. They said it was near a training facility, military. They said that's why the route timing had to match specific windows. A military training facility. Dara didn't have that in the case file. It hadn't appeared anywhere in 3 months of mapping, which meant either the case file was wrong about the corridor's endpoints, or, more likely, the first location was outside the section of the route she'd been assigned to map. She looked at Calloway. He was still on the phone, but his eyes had moved to her, and she could see from 20 feet away that the same thing had just changed in his calculation that had changed in hers. The second transport vehicle pulled out of the lot. Sorrel came up beside Dara. "Building's clear. We're setting up a full documentation team. The documentation in the main office section is significant. Manifests, contact lists, what looks like routing schedules going back at least 8 months." "Get me access to the routing schedules as soon as they're photographed," Dara said. "That's going to be Calloway's call." "Then tell him." Sorrel looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look, not resentment exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who came in expecting to be the most capable person on site and had been quietly revising that assessment for the past hour. "I'll tell him," she said, and went to find Calloway. Dara stood in the parking lot and looked at the building and thought about a military training facility and route timing and windows. She thought about the 3 red marks on the map in the substation in Graber's Mill. She'd seen 3 marks. She'd identified one as Meridian, which was confirmed. The other 2 she'd located roughly by their position relative to the road network. One was west, roughly in the direction of Caldwell City. One was east, at the far edge of the map, in a section that bled off the printed area. She hadn't been able to read the labels. She went back to Calloway, who had ended his call. "The substation search," she said. "How fast can they move?" "Teams en route, 40 minutes. The map in the hallway room. I need high-resolution photos of it before anyone moves anything. The location markers, specifically the easternmost one." She paused. "If I'm right about where the 3rd location is, we have a problem." "Define the problem." "The eastern end of the map corresponds to Felden Township. Felden has a National Guard training installation, Camp Deering. If the route timing is being coordinated around that facility's operational schedule, it means someone with access to that schedule is feeding timing information to the network. That's not a county-level problem." Calloway looked at her without expression for a moment. Then he said, "How confident are you?" 60%, maybe 70. I know it's not enough to present, but it's enough to not move until we understand what we might be walking into." He was quiet. Behind him, the helicopter was setting down in the east section of the lot, the rotor wash flattening the weeds along the fence line. The pilot cut the engine and the sound dropped in steps. "The man in the jacket," Dara said. "What's his ID?" Calloway looked at his phone. "Passport in the vehicle says Warren Greel. No record, no federal flag. Driving license out of a county that doesn't correspond to where he's been operating." "So it's a working ID, not a real one." "Probably. We'll process it." "When you interview him, don't start with Lantern. Start with Camp Deering. See how he reacts to the name before he knows why you're asking." Calloway gave her a look that she'd learned over 2 years of working with him meant, "I know how to do my job." She'd also learned it meant he was going to do exactly what she'd suggested. She left him to it and went to the tactical van, where a medic was doing a secondary check on the agents who'd entered the building. She sat on the van's rear bumper and held out her left hand. The medic looked at the cut, cleaned it, applied a closure strip. "You want a tetanus top-up?" he asked. "I'm current." "When?" 14 months ago." "You're current," he confirmed, and moved on. She sat on the bumper for a moment. Her right forearm had a bruise from the guard's elbow that was going to be spectacular by morning, already purple at the center, yellow starting at the edges. Her left knee ached where she'd hit the van's doorframe during the table collision. These were the kinds of injuries that didn't announce themselves immediately and then spent the next 3 days making their presence known. She was familiar with the pattern. She looked at the main building. The documentation team was setting up inside now, lights visible through the loading dock, the systematic sound of a search being organized. 8 months of routing schedules, contact lists, manifests. The woman with the bruise on her jaw had said 3 places on this route. Dara had stopped one of them tonight. The first one, west, near Caldwell City, was in the case file as a suspected location, which meant Calloway's team could move on it with what they already had. But the eastern location, the one at the far edge of the map, the one that might be coordinated with Camp Deering's schedule, that one was different. That one required a kind of institutional access that changed who you were looking for. She was tired. She was aware of being tired in the specific way you became aware of it when the adrenaline had done its work and then stopped and left everything else standing in the open. Her eyes felt gritty. Her mouth tasted like the coffee she hadn't drunk and the water she'd given to the girl in the back partition. She stood up. Sorrel came back across the lot. Calloway wants you in the main office section. The routing schedules are photographed. Dara followed her in. The office section was a converted room behind the loading dock administration area. A desk, 2 filing cabinets, a folding table covered in paper. The documentation team had laid out the photographed documents in sequence on the floor in the systematic grid pattern that made large volumes of paper legible quickly. Dara crouched over them. The routing schedules were organized by date, going back 9 months. Each entry had a 3-letter code for the origin point, a 3-letter code for the destination, a transport vehicle description, a personnel count. She paused on that, let it settle, and a timing window. The 3-letter destination code on the most recent entries was DEL, not a city abbreviation she recognized, not a county code. She looked at the pattern of the timing windows for DEL entries, consistently between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on dates that corresponded to. She did the mental calculation, cross-referencing against what she knew of Camp Deering's published training calendar, the parts that were publicly available, dates when the installation's overnight training rotations would have active movement on the perimeter roads. Cover for transport. Use the noise and movement of military training operations to mask civilian vehicle traffic. She sat back on her heels. That was sophisticated. That was not a Nolan Coulter sophistication or even a Warren Greal sophistication. That was someone with enough institutional knowledge to know that Camp Deering ran overnight rotations on specific dates and enough operational reach to build a transport schedule around it. Someone who had access to information that wasn't publicly available. Calloway, she said. He was already leaning over her shoulder. He'd been reading the same documents. DEL, she said. I see it. The timing windows. I see that too. He straightened up. His voice was very controlled, which was Calloway's version of alarmed. This goes to the interagency desk tonight. We're not running this ourselves anymore. Camp Deering has an incoming inspection cycle starting Monday, she said. She knew this because Calloway had mentioned it 3 weeks ago in a different context, a piece of information she'd stored without knowing why. If the network knows about the inspection, and if they have internal access, they do, they'll move the 3rd location's population before the inspection narrows access to the installation perimeter. Monday is 4 days away. 3.5, it's almost 2 in the morning. He looked at her. She looked at him. I need to make some calls, he said. I know. He walked out of the room. Dara stayed on the floor with the routing schedules spread out around her and thought about the 9 months of dates and the 3-letter codes and what they represented when you translated them back into people. She was very tired, and her hand hurt, and the girl from the back partition was on her way to a hospital, and that was the thing she kept returning to, not as comfort exactly, but as a fixed point. Something had worked. Something was better than it had been 4 hours ago. The rest of it was still running. She was reaching for the next page of schedules when Sorrel appeared in the doorway. Agent Voss? Something in her tone was different, not the professional flatness of the past hour, but something tighter. We have a problem. What is it? The man in the jacket, Warren Greal, or whoever he is. She paused. He's gone. Dara stood up. What do you mean, gone? The agent transporting him to the secondary holding vehicle stopped to manage a complication with one of the other detainees. Greal's zip strip was cut. The agent found it on the ground next to an open door. Sorrel's jaw was tight. He had help, someone on the exterior of the vehicle. We don't know who. Dara looked at the doorway, at the lot beyond it, at the dark tree line north of the fence. Greal was out, and he knew her face, her name, the extent of what she'd transmitted, and the fact that she'd identified Camp Deering as the next location. He would make contact with whoever sat above him in the network within minutes of getting clear, if he hadn't already. And whoever sat above him would begin moving the 3rd location's population tonight, not in 3.5 days. Tonight. She looked at her watch, 2:07 a.m. She looked at the routing schedules on the floor, and she looked at the DEL code on the most recent entry and the timing window beside it, 2:04. She was already in the window. Part 4, she had the routing schedules in her hand before Sorrel finished the sentence. Get Calloway, Dara said. She was already moving to the door of the office room, the photographed pages in her fist, not caring that she was wrinkling evidence because the evidence was already photographed. And what she needed right now was the physical reference, the ability to point at a specific line and say, here, this, now. Tell him Greal is going to make contact with the top of the network within the next 10 minutes, if he hasn't already, and the DL window is open right now. We're not waiting for an interagency desk. Sorrel hesitated, not from disagreement, from the friction of protocol meeting urgency. That's not... Sorrel. Dara looked at her directly. Find Calloway. She found him herself outside on the phone. She waited 4 seconds for him to register her expression and end the call. Greal knows about Deering, she said. She held up the schedule page. The DEL window, 2 to 4 a.m. It's open right now. If he's making contact, they're going to push the move tonight, not Monday. Tonight. Whatever's at the third location gets put in a vehicle in the next hour, and it disappears into a transport chain we haven't mapped. Calloway looked at the page. He looked at his watch. He had the face of someone running probability calculations that weren't producing comfortable results. We don't have a confirmed location for DEL, he said. We have a geographic direction. We have Camp Deering as the reference point. We have a timing pattern that suggests the transport uses the installation perimeter road to mask movement. She spread the pages, finding the one she wanted. Look at the vehicle descriptions on the DEL entries. Box truck, white, no markings. That's a specific vehicle profile. If Deering has any kind of gate log or perimeter camera system for the overnight rotation, a white unmarketed box truck at 2 in the morning is going to appear on it. That's assuming they log civilian traffic. The installation has an active security protocol during overnight rotations. They log everything that moves within a half-mile of the perimeter. I know this because the inspection cycle that starts Monday is partly a security audit. She paused. Calloway. Call Camp Deering Security directly, right now. Ask them to pull the last 90 days of perimeter logs for white box trucks between 2 and 4 a.m. That's one call. It gives us a pattern. It gives us coordinates. He was already dialing. She stood in the parking lot at 2:09 in the morning with the cold starting to get into the places where the adrenaline had worn off. Her joints, the back of her neck, the hand with the closure strip. And she listened to Calloway identify himself and request the duty security officer at Camp Deering and then hold. She looked at the tree line where Greal had vanished. Greal was out there somewhere, moving through the dark with a phone and a cut zip strip. And every minute she stood in this lot was a minute he was using. Calloway spoke for 2 minutes. He listened for 3. He ended the call. 11 white box trucks, he said. Same partial plate on 7 of them. The logs used the first 3 characters for civilian vehicles without base registration, consistent with a commercial plate prefix from Harbor County. He looked at her. And 2 return addresses logged by the security gate on the occasions when the trucks stopped at the perimeter checkpoint. Both the same address. Where? Ferris Creek Road, Felden Township, number 1640. She knew Felden Township from the map. She'd driven through the western edge of it on Route 9 tonight. 1640 Ferris Creek Road was, she calculated, roughly 8 miles northeast of Camp Deering's main gate. Rural, isolated, the kind of address that could be a farm, a commercial property, a converted warehouse, anything. How long to get there, she asked. 22 minutes from here, but I don't have a team to send. Sorrel's unit is documenting this site, the transport vehicles are en route to the hospital, and the backup team I called in is 45 minutes out. Then we go with what we have. What we have is you, me, Sorrel, and 2 agents. And the helicopter. He looked at the helicopter, now sitting dark and quiet, with the pilot doing something with his instrument panel. The pilot's a civilian contract. The helicopter has a searchlight and a speaker system, which we already demonstrated is effective. She held his gaze. If Greal is making contact right now, we have maybe 30 minutes before whoever is at 1640 Ferris Creek starts loading a vehicle. The helicopter gives us air coverage and communication. We use it. Calloway put his phone in his pocket. He had the expression of a man who had been in this profession long enough to know that the correct decision and the safe decision were not always the same thing, and had made peace with that at some point in his 40s. If this goes wrong, I know, she said. I mean it. If there are armed individuals at this location and we arrive with 5 people in a civilian helicopter, I know, Ren. He looked at her for one more moment, then he turned toward the helicopter. Get the pilot. Tell him we need air. They were moving in 6 minutes. The drive to Ferris Creek Road took 19 minutes because Sorrel drove the way she moved through buildings, with absolute decisiveness and no wasted motion. The second agent, a man named Pruitt, who'd said less than 4 words all night, rode in the back with Dara and checked his equipment with the focused repetition of someone managing pre-action nerves through procedure. Calloway was in front with Sorrel, on the phone for most of the drive, coordinating the backup team's positioning and giving the Deering duty officer enough information to put the installation on an informal alert without triggering a full security response that would create noise Greel might hear. Dara sat with the routing schedules in her lap and looked out the window at the dark fields and the occasional farmhouse light and thought about what she knew and what she didn't. She knew Greel was operational. She knew he had external contacts who'd had a vehicle positioned outside the holding facility, which meant those contacts were mobile and responsive. She didn't know how many people were at 1640 Ferris Creek. She didn't know whether they had the same forewarning she'd been afraid of, or whether Greel had been less than 10 minutes ahead of her. She thought about the 8-year-old child in the transport vehicle. She thought about the woman with the bruise on her jaw who'd said 3 places on this route in the same tone she might use to give directions, because she had done what you do when you have information and no power. She had held it carefully and given it to the first person she calculated might actually use it. Dara was going to use it. Sorrel turned onto Ferris Creek Road without the headlights, running on the ambient light from the sky, which was enough on a clear night to navigate a rural road at reduced speed. She cut the engine 400 meters short of the mailbox number. Calloway read off his phone, and they coasted the last 100 meters to a stop behind a stand of pines. The property at 1640 was lit. Not brightly. 2 exterior security lights on motion sensor poles and a light on inside what looked like the main structure, a converted commercial building similar in footprint to Meridian but newer. The gate was open. In the loading area visible from the road, a white box truck was backed up to a loading dock. It was not empty. 2 men were moving between the dock and the truck's rear doors, carrying what looked like supply cases, and their movement had the specific hurried quality of people working faster than they normally would. "They're loading," Sorrel said quietly. "Yes," Dara said. Calloway had his phone to his ear. He spoke 3 words, ended the call. "Helicopter is 2 minutes out. Backup team is 16 minutes. 16 minutes is too long," Pruitt said. It was the most he'd said all night. He was right. "We can't wait for backup," Dara said. "If they get that truck out the gate before we can stop it, we lose it. Rural road network, dark. They could be on 3 different routes within 5 minutes. We won't find it before daylight." "What's the approach?" Sorrel asked. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for Dara's read on the terrain, because Dara had been watching it longer. "The helicopter comes in from the north. It's the direction they won't expect. The road is east. When the searchlight activates, they'll stop moving. Maybe 30 seconds of disorientation. We come through the gate in the vehicle during that 30 seconds, and we position between the truck and the exit." She paused. "The loading dock is on the south wall. If there are people inside the building, the dock door is their fastest exit. 1 person covers the dock." "That's me," Pruitt said. "Sorrel and I take the gate approach. Calloway coordinates from the vehicle and manages contact with backup." She looked at Calloway, because this was his operation, and she was technically a field agent without tactical team authority, and she had been operating well outside her parameters since about midnight. He looked back at her with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and something else she didn't have a name for. "You're covering the approach with Sorrel," he confirmed. Above them, faint but growing, the helicopter. It came from the north as she'd described, running dark for the first 10 seconds, and the searchlight activated when it crossed the property fence line, flooding the loading dock in white. The 2 men on the dock froze. One of them dropped the case he was carrying, and it hit the dock with a sound she could hear from 400 meters, which meant the case was metal, which meant the contents were heavy and rigid. The helicopter's speaker system activated, the same federal identification announcement they'd used at Meridian, clear, loud, directionless from the ground. Sorrel had the vehicle moving before the announcement finished. The gate approach was fast, 40 meters of gravel drive from the road to the dock area. Sorrel driving hard without lights, the searchlight's overflow giving them enough ambient illumination to navigate. They positioned the vehicle diagonally across the access lane between the dock and the gate, which blocked the truck's exit route, and both doors opened simultaneously. Dara was out and moving toward the dock before the vehicle fully stopped. One of the men on the dock had recovered faster than the other and was backing toward the interior door. Not a threat response, a flight response, which was actually more dangerous in some ways because it meant he was heading toward whatever was inside. She called out her identification and moved to cut off his angle. He stopped when she got between him and the door. "Hands," she said. He put his hands up. I was younger than she'd expected. Mid-20s, work clothes, the particular blank expression of someone who has just realized the version of events they'd been operating under was significantly incomplete. The second man on the dock was already face down with Sorrel's knee in his back. Pruitt had gone around the building's south corner at a run, heading for the dock door's exterior. Dara kept her eyes on the young man with his hands up and listened to the building. Voices inside, one, maybe two. A sound that might have been a door, then nothing. The helicopter was holding its position overhead, the searchlight sweeping in a slow pattern that created moving shadows across the dock. "How many people inside?" she asked the young man. He said nothing. "How many people are still in the building?" He looked at the interior door, then back at her. "Two," he said. The word came out like something he'd made a decision about. "Two men. They were in the office when the lights hit." A pause. "And the others?" "How many others?" "I don't know exactly. I just drive the truck. They tell me where and when. I don't—" He stopped. "I don't go inside." She looked at him for a moment. The helicopter noise made it hard to read tone, but his body language was not deceptive. He was scared and he was talking, and he genuinely might not know the specific count, because the operation was compartmentalized and he was, as he'd said, a driver. Someone who loaded and moved and didn't ask what he was moving, or had asked once and been given an answer that made not asking easier. That was its own kind of complicity, and it was not her job to address it here in the dark with a helicopter overhead. Shazip stripped his wrists. Last one, she was now out, and pointed him toward Calloway's vehicle. Then she tried the interior door. It opened into a short corridor. At the end, a second door. She moved through it fast and came into the main space, larger than it had looked from outside. Two sections. The left half was empty commercial space, concrete floor, nothing. The right half was partitioned, not with plywood this time, but with actual temporary wall panels, the kind you could order for industrial use, more permanent looking. The panels didn't go to the ceiling. Above them, the fluorescent lights of the main building. From behind the panels, sounds. One of the interior doors on the right wall swung open, and a man came through it moving fast, and she was in his path, and he corrected course hard to avoid her, which meant he ran directly into the partition wall, which collapsed. The temporary panels were not anchored well, and the whole section folded in a sequence of plastic snapping sounds, like a row of dominoes. Behind the panels, a room. A dozen people at minimum, some standing, some seated, all of them flinching at the sudden absence of wall. And at the back of the space, caught in the fluorescent light, a man who had not tried to run. He was in his 50s, in a sport coat over a collared shirt, and he was standing with his hands already partway up in the position of someone who had calculated the situation faster than his colleagues and arrived at a different conclusion about the optimal response. He had a calm, arranged quality, not the cultivated blankness of Greel, but something more institutional. The kind of calm that came from spending decades in environments where appearing unrattled was professionally advantageous. She didn't recognize his face, but she recognized the insignia on the jacket's lapel pin. A small enamel piece, military branch designation, the kind of pin that former officers wore long after their service because it was a signal, a credential, a door that stayed open. She recognized the branch. Camp Deering's parent command. "Agent Voss," he said. He said her name the way people said a name when they already knew it, not from a badge, but from a briefing. "I think we should talk." "We will," she said. "After you put your hands behind your back." He looked at her hands. She wasn't holding a weapon. She had a flashlight and a trauma kit and a federal badge. He was in a room with a collapsed partition and 14 frightened people in a helicopter overhead, and he had the expression of a man who was revising his assessment of the conversation he was about to have. He put his hands behind his back. Pruitt came through the exterior dock door 30 seconds later, slightly winded, and stopped at the sight of the man in the sport coat. Dara could see from across the room that Pruitt recognized him, or recognized the significance of who he appeared to be. Pruitt looked at Dara. She looked back at him. "Get Calloway." Pruitt got Calloway. What followed was methodical and slow and not dramatic in the way the past 3 hours had been. Calloway came through the door and saw the man in the sport coat and did not visibly react, which was its own significant reaction, because Calloway was capable of visibly not reacting only when the thing he was not reacting to was genuinely substantial. He took one look at the lapel pin and got on his phone and walked back out of the building and stood in the parking lot for 11 minutes straight, making calls. During those 11 minutes, Dara coordinated the documentation of the space. She'd stopped caring about whether this was technically her role approximately 4 hours ago, and spoke individually to 3 of the people in the room who indicated they could communicate in English, gathering basic status and urgency information for the medical team. Nobody here was in the acute condition of the girl from the back partition. Several people had been here longer than the group at Meridian. The space was better maintained, which she noted with a specific complicated disgust, because better maintained meant it had been designed for longer-term use. The man in the sport coat sat on the floor with his wrists zip-stripped and said nothing. He had adjusted his calculation again, apparently, and the new calculation had produced silence as the optimal output. He sat with the particular stillness of someone who had spent time in difficult rooms before, and knew that anything he said became part of a record, and that records had a way of being comprehensive. Calloway came back in. He crouched in front of the man in the sport coat. "Colonel David Tarrant," Calloway said. It wasn't a question. The man said nothing. "Retired, 14 months. Former logistics coordination officer, Camp Deering." Calloway's voice was level and clinical. "That's from your personnel file, which we pulled 4 minutes ago. You want to know what else is in it?" "Nothing." "There's a note in your post-retirement security review about unexplained income. The review was flagged and then unflagged 8 months ago. Somebody with access to the review system changed its priority classification from active to monitoring only." He paused. "That's going to get changed back tonight." Tarrant looked at the floor. "The routing schedules at Meridian go back 9 months. Calloway continued. "Your retirement date is 14 months ago, which means you started the DEL pipeline 2 months after you left the installation. That's a short turnaround, which suggests you started planning it before you left, while you still had access to the schedule." Another pause. "That's a federal charge on its own. We haven't gotten to the rest of it." Tarrant said, "I want counsel." "You'll have it." Calloway stood up. "You'll also have a federal prosecutor in a room with 9 months of routing schedules, 31 confirmed victims across 3 locations, 2 deputies and 3 civilian operators in custody, and a dead woman's identification in the manifest records from Meridian, which the documentation team found 20 minutes ago and which is going to be the detail that makes everything else immovable." He said it quietly, not for effect, just so it was said and heard, and part of the space Tarrant was sitting in. "Counsel is not going to change any of that." Tarrant closed his eyes. He kept them closed for several seconds. When he opened them, he was looking at the floor and his face had the specific quality of a man watching something he'd spent years building become something he'd spent years trying to explain. Dara watched him from across the room and felt none of the satisfaction she sometimes expected to feel in these moments. What she felt instead was the weight of the dead woman's ID in the manifest, which she hadn't known about until 30 seconds ago and which she would think about for a long time. Someone who hadn't made it to any of the 3 locations, or who had made it through the system and come out the other side in the worst possible way, and whose name was now in a federal record because a documentation team in a warehouse at 2 in the morning had found a manifest and done their job. The backup team arrived at 1640 Ferris Creek Road at 2:51 a.m. 8 agents, a dedicated medical team, 2 transport vehicles. Enough to properly process the site and move all 14 victims with appropriate care. Dara briefed the team lead for 4 minutes, gave him the names of the individuals she'd spoken to and their medical status assessments, and then stepped back. She stood outside the building in the cold and looked at the helicopter, which was back on the ground in the field adjacent to the property, its pilot leaning against the landing skid eating a granola bar with the detached patience of someone who'd been contracted for unusual hours before. Calloway came out. Terrence going to cooperate, he said. He didn't sound pleased about it. He sounded like someone who'd expected it and was managing the implications. His counsel is going to recommend cooperation as the best available option, and he's going to take it, and that means he's going to give us everyone above him. There's someone above him. Based on the financial structure, yes. The income the security review flagged wasn't operational cash. It was a salary payment, effectively. He was being paid by something that looks, on the surface, like a logistics consulting firm. He paused. The firm is registered in 3 states. None of them are this one. That's the head. That's the direction of the head. Finding the actual structure is going to take time. How much time? Weeks, maybe longer. He looked at her. That part isn't going to happen tonight. She nodded. She'd known that. Some things broke fast and some things broke slowly, and knowing which kind you were dealing with was the difference between pushing when you should push and holding when you should hold. Tonight had been the fast kind, the part that required being in the right place at the right time and making decisions fast enough that the system didn't have time to fold itself shut. The slow kind, the financial forensics and the network mapping and the weeks of building a case against a consulting firm in 3 states, was different work done by different people in different rooms, and she could give them everything she'd gathered and let them do it. She was very tired. The girl, she said, from the back partition at Meridian. Dr. Ferris reported in from the hospital 40 minutes ago. She's stable. Fever's responding. He paused. Ankle is a hairline fracture, not a full break. She'll be walking in 6 weeks. Dara let out a breath. Her name is Priya Sen, Calloway said. She's 17. She's been missing from her family's home in Caldwell City for 11 weeks. 11 weeks. The same amount of time Dara had been running this case. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would be proportionate. Her parents were notified an hour ago, Calloway added. He said it carefully, not as comfort, but as information. She nodded again. Across the field, the pilot had finished his granola bar and was running a pre-flight check, which presumably meant Calloway had arranged another flight for someone. She looked at the building where the backup team was working and at the white box truck still backed up to the loading dock, its rear doors hanging open, and at the tree line to the north, where Camp Deering's perimeter lights were faintly visible. Greil, she said. Where are we on Greil? Calloway's expression answered the question before his words did. State police have a bolo. The vehicle that helped him clear the Meridian lot was picked up on a traffic camera on Route 9 heading west. We lost it before the county line. West is toward Caldwell City. I know. If he's heading toward the network's logistics base, I know, Dara. His voice was patient and tired in equal measure. State police are running it. We have everything we can put on it tonight. She understood what he was telling her. It was 2:53 in the morning. She had been running since before midnight. She had documented 2 sites, secured 3 detainees, located 31 victims across 2 operations, and identified a retired military logistics officer as the network's primary institutional access point. Greil was a real and active problem, but he was not the only resource tracking him, and continuing to pursue him personally at this hour, in this state, would eventually produce a version of competent that shaded into reckless. She had been watching that line carefully all night. She was close to it now. The consulting firm, she said. When the financial forensics team starts pulling it, I want access to the preliminary findings. Not the full case, just the preliminary. I'll flag it. And the routing schedules from Meridian, all of them. Not just the DEL entries, the full 9 months. Also done. He looked at her steadily. Is there anything else? Or can we get you a vehicle and a hotel? And have this conversation in the morning? Morning, when it's actually the morning? She looked at the building. She thought about the consulting firm in 3 states. She thought about Greil heading west on Route 9 at 2 in the morning. She thought about the dead woman in the manifest from Meridian, whose name she didn't know yet, and the specific kind of weight that name was going to carry when she learned it. And she thought about something the young man on the loading dock had said, in the moment after he'd told her he was a driver and didn't go inside. He'd said, I just drive the truck. They tell me where and when. He'd said they. Not the man in the flannel shirt, not Tarrant, not the 2 men at the card table. They. A generic reflexive plural that could mean anyone, and probably meant he didn't know who above Greil, above Tarrant, above the logistics consulting firm was making the decisions. But when Calloway had said weeks, maybe longer, she had also thought about the timing of it. The inspection cycle at Camp Deering, which started Monday, and which had been, she now understood, one of the reasons the network was accelerating its timeline. The inspection hadn't been random. Inspections like that got scheduled. They got coordinated between multiple offices, and the scheduling information got distributed to administrative staff across several departments, and one of those departments would have a list of who received the notification. She'd been assuming the consulting firm was the origin of the network, but if the network had been operating for more than 9 months, and if the inspection scheduling had been used to time the acceleration, then someone had been feeding inspection cycle information to the network for at least as long as the DEL entries went back. That person was not Tarrant. Tarrant was retired. He wouldn't have received the inspection notification. Someone currently inside the installation had. "Calloway," she said. He had his keys out. He stopped. "The inspection cycle notification. Who receives it at the installation level?" He looked at her. His keys were still in his hand, not moving. "Command staff. Senior logistics. The security office." He was following the same path she was following. She could see it. "And the external coordination contacts, which includes adjacent command facilities, the regional oversight office." He paused. "And contracted support services." Contracted support services. She looked at him. The consulting firm. Could be a different firm. Could be the same one pulling double duty. Contracted to the installation for support services, simultaneously running the logistics arm of the network, using the contract access to receive scheduling information and then routing it to the operational side. She could hear how it sounded as she was saying it, elaborate, multi-layered, the kind of structure that sounded like theory until you found the one document that made it concrete. It would explain how Tarrant got connected to them so fast after retirement. He didn't find them. They recruited him specifically because he was leaving and they were already inside and needed a post-retirement conduit who wouldn't appear in the active personnel database. Calloway was quiet for almost 10 seconds. Then he said, "If the consulting firm has a current service contract with Camp Deering, that contract is a matter of installation record. And the duty officer I spoke to tonight owes me a follow-up call. That call needs to happen before the inspection team arrives Monday." "I know." He put his keys back in his pocket. He was not going to give her a vehicle and a hotel. She had known that for the last 30 seconds. "Come inside. The documentation team has a satellite connection." She followed him back through the door and stopped. Standing just inside the building, talking to one of the backup team agents in a low, urgent voice, was a man she hadn't seen at either site tonight. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, jeans, the kind of generic outdoor gear that said nothing about who you were, and he had the temporary ID lanyard of an agent who'd been issued credentials at a secondary staging location rather than from the primary team's supply. He was young, late 20s maybe, with a face that was tense with the specific tension of someone delivering information they're not sure how it will be received. He looked up when she came through the door. He looked at her badge. "You're Voss?" he said. "Yes." "I've been trying to reach your handler for 40 minutes. He held out a phone. Not his phone, a phone he'd been carrying for someone else. "Betta Marsh, she says she's been monitoring your frequency since you reached out at..." He checked the screen. "Approximately 12:45 a.m. She says she's been capturing a secondary transmission on the same frequency for the last 2 hours. Dara went very still. "A secondary transmission," she said. "Yes. She says it's not military-grade equipment. It's commercial encrypted, similar to your device, but broadcasting on a slightly offset channel. She almost missed it." He held the phone out further. "She says you need to hear the content. She says it changes the picture." She took the phone. She put it to her ear. Bet Marsh's voice was flat and alert, in the way it always was at any hour, because Bet Marsh had a metabolism for information that didn't vary by time of day. "Dara, the secondary transmission started at approximately 1:15 a.m. It's been broadcasting in burst intervals, same technology as yours, same commercial frequency band, offset by about 4 megahertz, which is why I almost logged it as interference. I've been decoding it for the last 90 minutes. "What's in it?" Dara asked. "Surveillance data," Bet said. "Location pings, vehicle descriptions, personnel movements." A pause. "On you." Someone has been tracking your movements tonight and transmitting your location in real time to an external receiver. The phone felt heavier in her hand. The transmission origin point, Bet continued, is consistent with a stationary source inside the Meridian cold storage facility. Meridian, where the backup team was currently finishing documentation, where Calloway's agents had been working for the past hour and a half, moving through the building with their equipment and their cameras and their evidence collection protocols. Stationary source. Something that had been left there deliberately. Something that had been transmitting while she sat on the bumper getting her hand wrapped. While Calloway made calls. While Sorrell organized the documentation grid. Something that had been transmitting her location, her vehicle, her personnel count to an external receiver in real time. And the transmission had started at 1:15 a.m. Warren Greel had escaped at approximately 1:10. He hadn't run west to warn the network. He'd stopped long enough to activate a device that was already in place at Meridian, a contingency, something planted in advance for exactly the scenario where the site got compromised and someone needed to track whatever came next. And then he'd continued. And while she was driving to Ferris Creek Road, while she was finding Tarrant, while Calloway was making calls to the duty officer at Camp Deering, a receiver somewhere had been watching all of it. "Where is the external receiver?" she asked. "That's what I've been working on," Bet said. "The signal has a return ping function. I've been bouncing a locator off it for the last 40 minutes, and the receiver has been in approximately the same location the entire time." "Where, Bet?" A pause. 1420 Harbor County Line Road. I pulled the address from a property registry. It's registered to a holding company. The holding company's registered agent is a law firm in Bet. The law firm is the same registered agent on file for the consulting firm that's been flagged in your network's financial records. The room behind her was full of federal agents documenting a crime scene. Calloway was 6 feet away. Tarrant was on the floor with his wrists bound. The backup team was processing 31 victims across 2 locations. And at 1420 Harbor County Line Road, someone with access to a receiving device and 9 months of routing intelligence had been watching everything that had happened tonight, in real time, from a location that no one had gone to yet. Dara looked at Calloway. He'd been close enough to hear Bet's voice through the phone, if not the words. He read her face and said nothing. She held out the phone to him. "Listen to the last part again," she said. "Then we need to go." Part 5. Calloway listened to Bet Marsh for 90 seconds without interrupting her. Then he handed the phone back to Dara, and he stood very still for a moment in the way he stood still when he was restructuring something large and fundamental inside his operational picture. She had seen him do this twice before. Both times, what came out the other side of the stillness was a decision that proved correct in retrospect and costly in the present. 1420 Harbor County Line Road, he said. "Yes. That's 12 minutes from here." 11, Sorrell said from the doorway. She had been listening long enough to know what was being discussed. Calloway looked at Tarrant, still on the floor, watching them with the sealed expression of a man who had requested counsel and was holding that request like a physical object he wasn't going to put down. Then he looked at the backup team lead, a solid, unhurried man named Grafton, who had taken over the site documentation with the competence of someone who didn't need to be supervised. "Grafton, you have the site. Nothing moves, nobody leaves without my authorization." Grafton nodded once. "Sorrell, Pruitt, we're going." He looked at Dara. "You're not field clear for a direct approach on an unknown location." "I know." "You'll stay with the vehicle." She looked at him. They both knew what staying with the vehicle meant and what it didn't mean, and they both knew she was going to be whatever was necessary when they arrived at whatever was at 1420 Harbor County Line Road, and neither of them said any of that out loud. "Understood," she said. They went. Sorrell drove again, and Pruitt sat in back again, and Calloway was on the phone again, this time to the backup team's staging coordinator, repositioning 2 of the 8 agents toward the county line address. They would be 5 minutes behind. The helicopter was back in the air before they reached the property gate. She heard it lifting as they pulled onto the road. 11 minutes. She sat in the back seat and looked at her phone, which had 2 bars of signal now. They'd moved far enough from wherever the jammer had been operating, and she pulled up everything Bet had sent to her secure inbox in the past hour. 3 files. She opened the first, the decoded burst transmissions, laid out in timestamp order. 14 separate signals since 1:15 a.m., each one a coordinate cluster and a text string. She read them in order. The first three were her own coordinates from when she'd been at Meridian. The fourth was the coordinate of Sorrell's vehicle at the gate. The fifth, sixth, and seventh tracked the movement from Meridian to Ferris Creek Road, accurate to within 40 meters. Someone had been feeding this in real time, and the device doing it was small enough to be stationary inside a building that 4 federal agents had been moving through for 90 minutes without spotting it. The text strings were curt and technical, abbreviations she didn't all recognize, some that she did. One of the ones she recognized appeared twice, VOS ID, her identification, her name encoded. The device operator, wherever they were receiving, had been informed specifically who they were tracking. She was not an incidental observation. She had been a target from the start, not just a suspicious van at a rest stop, not just someone who'd gotten too close. A named target with a dedicated surveillance package. The second file was the property registry. 1420 Harbor County Line Road, 4.2 acres, commercial zoning, structures listed as a main residential conversion and a detached outbuilding. Owned since 31 months ago by a holding company called Vantage Meridian LLC, not Meridian Cold Storage, a different entity, but the shared name was not coincidental. Registered agent, a law firm in the state capital, the law firm that matched the consulting firm's registration. The third file was a photograph. Bet had pulled it from a commercial database, a business registration photo, the kind used for state licensing. It showed a storefront, nondescript, a small professional services office. In the window, a logo, a compass rose above the firm name. Callaway's financial forensics team was going to spend weeks on this. The photograph was not going to speed that up. But in the reflection of the window glass, caught by the photographer's angle, was a parked vehicle. Dark sedan. Partial plate visible. She couldn't read it clearly on the phone screen. She sent the image to Callaway's number with a single line, reflection, passenger side plate. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. He forwarded it without comment to someone she didn't have a name for. They turned onto Harbor County Line Road at 3:09 a.m. The property at 1420 sat back from the road behind a gravel drive and a row of ornamental trees that had probably looked deliberate when they were planted and now just looked like a windbreak. The main structure was a converted farmhouse, 2 stories, lights on in 2 rooms on the ground floor, a vehicle in the drive that matched the dark sedan from the photograph reflection closely enough that it matched completely as far as Dara was concerned. The outbuilding was dark. Sorrell stopped the vehicle 200 meters short, same approach as Ferris Creek. The helicopter was already repositioning from the south, running dark, holding altitude. Callaway got out and stood beside the vehicle with his phone and his notebook, and he looked at the house for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't seen him do at either of the previous sites. He called the number directly. She heard it because he didn't move away. He stood 6 feet from the vehicle and dialed and put the phone on speaker and held it where they could all hear. It rang 4 times. Then a voice. "This is not a conversation I'm going to have on a phone," the voice said. Male, older, the precise and careful diction of someone who had spent decades in rooms where what you said was recorded and how you said it mattered. "Then come to the front door," Callaway said. "There are federal agents on 3 sides of your property and air coverage overhead. The phone call is the courtesy, the alternative is the door." A pause. "How many?" "Enough." Another pause, longer. Then, "Give me 2 minutes." Callaway ended the call. He looked at Dara. She looked at the house. The front door opened in 90 seconds, not 2 minutes. The man who came through it was in his mid-60s, in a cardigan and dress trousers that suggested he'd been awake and dressed rather than pulled from sleep, which meant he'd been awake watching the receiver and had prepared for this possibility sometime in the last hour. He was tall, slightly stooped in the shoulders, with the look of someone who had once been physically imposing and had redistributed that quality into the kind of presence that didn't need size to occupy a room. He walked to the edge of his porch and stopped. Sorrell and Pruitt moved toward the house. Callaway walked up the drive. Dara got out of the vehicle. She was not supposed to approach. She knew that. She walked up the drive anyway, staying behind Callaway and to the left, because she had been tracking this network for 3 months and had spent the last 4 hours inside it, and she wanted to see this man's face when the accounting began. That was not entirely professional. She accepted that. The man on the porch looked at the approaching agents and then past them, and his eyes settled on her. On the scrubs, the torn sleeve, the badge clipped to her front, the closure strip on her left hand. He looked at her the way the man in the flannel shirt had looked at her in the substation, with recognition. But unlike Greel, what moved across this man's face was not calculation. It was something closer to acknowledgement. The specific, reluctant acknowledgement of someone who has underestimated an opponent and is now in the physical presence of that miscalculation. "You're Voss," he said. "Yes." "You're younger than I expected." "People usually do," she said. Calloway had reached the porch steps. He had his badge out, and he had the particular forward stillness of someone about to deliver a formal statement, which he did. Name, agency, the specific federal statutes, the right to counsel. He did it correctly and completely, and the man on the porch listened to all of it without looking away from Dara. His name, as it turned out, was Ellison Core. Core Ellison on paper, but he'd gone by Ellison for 40 years, and the documentation used both. Former state government contracting officer. Retired 6 years ago. Built Vantage Meridian LLC 8 months after retirement. Had been running what the charging documents would eventually describe as a multi-state trafficking logistics network through a series of contracted service firms that provided legitimate cover services to county governments, rural hospitals, and military installations. The cover services were real, generating real revenue, making the financial structure nearly opaque until you knew where to look. He had built Lantern to look like nothing from the outside. Not a criminal enterprise, a collection of boring, unglamorous service contracts. The kind of thing nobody looked at twice. The same logic she had used to look like a traveling nurse for 3 months. He handed her that thought himself, standing on his porch with sorrel beside him and cuffs on his wrists, when he said, "You know, the nurse cover was almost perfect. You'd studied it properly." "I had good source material," she said. "The van was the tell. Too consistent. Same plates, same route pattern. We flagged it in month 2. "I know. That's why I modified my secondary communication setup in month 2. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not admiration, which would have been insulting from where he was standing, but the particular recognition of a person who had built a careful system and was now in the presence of someone who had been building a careful counter to it at the same time, in parallel, without either of them knowing the other was there. "You transmitted to someone outside our intercept range," he said. "Yes." "Who?" "Someone you don't know," she said. That was the point. Sorrel guided him toward the vehicle. He went without resistance, which was not the same as cooperation. It was the practiced compliance of someone who understood that the next several years of his life were going to be spent in rooms with lawyers and prosecutors, and that this porch was the last place he had any choice about what happened next. Dara watched him go. She stood in the driveway for a moment after the vehicle door closed. The helicopter had come down in the field adjacent to the property, and its rotors were winding down in the diminishing spiral of a long evening ending. The second backup team vehicle arrived at the gate, and its agents deployed toward the outbuilding with flashlights. In the trees at the property line, a bird made one sound and then was silent. It was 3:24 in the morning. She was standing in a gravel driveway in Harbor County with a torn sleeve and a bandaged hand, and the specific bone-level exhaustion of someone who had been awake since before this had started and might not sleep until after it finished. She was also standing on the other side of something that had been running for 3 months and had, in the last 4 hours, broken open. Not cleanly. Nothing like this broke cleanly, but open, exposed, drained of the particular power it had depended on, which was the power of looking like nothing. She had also looked like nothing. For 11 weeks, she had looked exactly like the kind of person that people like Ellison Core built systems around. Unremarkable, predictable, forgettable. A traveling nurse in a white van. Someone who could be sent away from a highway rest stop or pulled in for questioning or dismissed at a county substation without causing any particular alarm. She had used that invisibility the same way they had. She had just used it for something different. Calloway came up beside her. "Outbuilding has the receiver set up. Grafton's team is going to want to see it before we move it. Betta Marsh's documentation of the signal intercept is going to be..." He paused. "We're going to need to have a conversation about Bet Marsh." "I know." "The unauthorized device..." "I know, Wren." "The equipment modification to the cover vehicle." "I know." She looked at him. "Later." He was quiet for a moment. Then, later, he agreed. She looked at the house, lights still on in the 2 ground floor rooms, the front door still open the way Cor had left it when he came out, the porch light casting a warm yellow oval onto the steps. In 6 hours, it was going to be full of federal evidence technicians, and in 6 weeks, it was going to be cited in charging documents, and in some number of months, it was going to be referenced in a federal prosecution that would take years to fully resolve. That was how this kind of thing went, fast at the end and long in the aftermath. Warren Greel, she said. State police picked him up 40 minutes ago. Calloway had his phone out. He showed her the notification. Route 9 westbound. He'd pulled over at a gas station. The vehicle that helped him clear Meridian ran out of fuel. He was sitting in the parking lot. She looked at the notification. Grayson Warren Greel, his actual name as it turned out, former private investigator with a suspended license, 2 civil fraud judgments, and now a federal arrest for his role in a trafficking conspiracy that had just gotten significantly larger and better documented than it had been 24 hours ago. He'd sat in a gas station parking lot because whoever he'd thought was going to help him didn't answer, and whoever above Greel he'd been trying to reach was now in a vehicle with Sorrell and federal charges. The network's head had been cut off and the body hadn't gotten the message yet, which was the operational window she'd been trying to stay inside all night. Nolan Coulter, she said, in federal custody. His lawyer arrived an hour ago. A pause. His lawyer also advised him to cooperate, and he's been talking since 10 minutes after that. He wasn't the worst of them. He wasn't the best of them either. No, she agreed. But he was the one who almost got a first aid kit for a sick 17-year-old girl in a parking lot. That's something. Calloway looked at her. Is it? She thought about it honestly. It's not exculpatory, but it's human. And human means reachable, and reachable means useful, and his testimony is going to be part of what closes every door in this case. She paused. So yes, it's something. He didn't argue with that. She got back in the vehicle. She leaned her head against the window and looked at the property going past as Sorrell turned the car and started back toward the main road. And she thought about sleeping and thought about the dead woman's name in the Meridian manifest that she still hadn't been told. She would ask when they got back. She would ask because not knowing felt wrong, like allowing the night to be defined entirely by what had been stopped without acknowledging what hadn't been prevented, and that wasn't accurate. The case file would say 31 victims recovered and 1 death, and both of those numbers would be true, and they needed to coexist without one canceling the other. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested, which was the closest thing available. 3 weeks later, Dara Voss sat across a conference table from a federal prosecutor named Adeline Swick, who had the particular energy of someone who found very complex cases interesting in the way that other people found vacations interesting. Swick had a stack of charging documents 18 inches tall and was working through them with the systematic pleasure of someone doing exactly what they were built to do. I want to walk through the core financials with you, Swick said, because there are 3 transactions in month 4 that the forensics team can document but not explain, and you were running the corridor during that period. Month 4, Dara said. That corresponds to the shift in the DEL routing window. They moved from a 4-hour window to a 2-hour window. The compression probably generated unusual financial activity because they had to consolidate 2 transport costs into a tighter schedule. Swick wrote something. She wrote things by hand, which Dara respected as a practice, if not always as an efficient use of time. That's what I thought. I wanted the operational confirmation. She looked up. The Greel arraignment is Tuesday. Terrence's plea agreement is being finalized. He gave us 11 additional contacts in the network infrastructure. 7 of them are new to the case file. The consulting firm? Vantage Meridian is dissolved by court order as of last Thursday. The principals, 3 of them besides Coar, are all named in the broader indictment. 2 cooperating, 1 contesting. She paused. Coar is not cooperating. I know. He's going to trial. I know that too. Swick looked at her steadily. You're going to testify. Yes. It'll be thorough. His counsel is going to argue that the operational structure was legally ambiguous, that the service contracts were legitimate, and he had no direct knowledge of the trafficking component. His receiver at 1420 had my name on it, Dara said, in the decoded transmissions. My actual name, not my cover. He knew I was FBI by the time he set up the surveillance on me. Whatever ambiguity existed before that point, it ended there. Swick nodded slowly. That's the line I'm going to use in opening. Good. It's a strong line. She gathered a set of documents and aligned them with the deliberate neatness of someone who thought in organized categories. The Camp Deering connection. The security audit found 2 additional staff members with access to the rotation schedule who were also listed in Vantage Meridian's contractor personnel files. Both are on administrative leave pending investigation. That's the institutional piece Tarrant never explained. He says he doesn't know who made the initial contact with Deering staff. He says by the time he was recruited, the access was already in place. She paused. That may be true. It may not be. We're still building that section of the case. Dara looked at the stack of documents. 18 inches of paper representing 3 months of her undercover work, 4 hours of a night in Harbor County, and the 3-week aftermath of processing what those 4 hours had produced. 31 people who had come out of holding facilities in varying states of physical and emotional damage. One woman, 32 years old, originally from outside the county, whose name was Freya Holst, who had died in transport sometime in the 6 weeks before Dara had reached any of those facilities. Freya Holst was in the charging documents as a victim and would be referenced in every prosecution that came from this case, and Dara had looked at her missing persons file 3 days after the arrests and had spent an uncomfortable 40 minutes sitting with the fact that 11 weeks of undercover work had overlapped with the period of Freya Holst's death, and that the overlap was not something she could resolve or reconcile. Only carry. She was carrying it. That was what you did. The Victim Services Coordination, Dara said. Where are we? All 31 have been connected to caseworkers. Priya Sen has been home for 18 days. Her parents' attorney contacted the Bureau to ask about the investigation timeline. Swick looked at her over the document stack. They also asked to pass along a message to the agent responsible for the initial recovery. That's not necessary. The message is, she's eating again. That's the entire message. Swick said it simply. I thought you should have it. Dara was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. The woman with the bruise on her jaw, whose name was Tara Osei, who had been missing for 7 weeks, who had learned enough about the network's operations from listening to guards, who assumed she didn't understand them, that her statement alone had filled 14 pages of the case file, was back in Caldwell City and had requested to be kept informed of prosecution progress. The Bureau didn't do that routinely. Dara had personally ensured she was assigned a victim advocate who understood the specific request and would honor it. Tara Osei had walked into a federal transport vehicle at 2 a.m. in a chain-link parking lot and said there are more places because she had gathered information for 7 weeks in conditions that would have unmade most people, and she had given it to the first person she calculated might actually use it. Dara had used it. The debt of that was not the kind you paid off with a phone call or a case update. It was the kind you carried differently than the other things you carried, not as weight, but as direction. The meeting with Swick lasted another 2 hours. When it ended, Dara walked out of the federal building into an October afternoon that was cold and clear, the sky the particular shade of blue that only appeared after the season's first hard frost, and she stood on the steps for a moment in her actual clothes. Not scrubs, not a cover identity, just a jacket and jeans and the badge on her belt that was always her badge, even when she was dressed as someone else. Her phone rang. Calloway. 2 things, he said. First, the debrief panel recommendation came through. They're recommending a formal commendation for the Harbor County operation. Okay, she said. You don't sound enthused. I'm not unenthused, I'm just tired. The second thing. A pause. The case supervisor wants to talk to you about a new position, not another long-term undercover. A coordination role, leading a joint task force focused on trafficking corridor identification and federal-local intelligence integration. They want someone who understands how these networks embed in legitimate infrastructure. Another pause. Someone who has done it from the inside. She sat down on the federal building steps. A woman walking past with a coffee gave her a brief, neutral look. A person sitting on steps, unremarkable, nothing to look at twice, and walked on. Where would it be based? She said. Caldwell City, initially. The regional office there has the infrastructure. Caldwell City, the city where Priya Sen's family was, where the western end of the Lantern Corridor had originated. where a network of county roads and highway rest stops and medical transport vehicles had become the architecture of something systematic and deliberate, hiding in the boredom of the ordinary. "Tell the case supervisor yes," she said. "You're not going to think about it?" "I've thought about it since the night it happened. Tell him yes." Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "I figured," he said. "I've already told him yes." She shook her head, staring at the blue sky. "One more thing," Calloway said, and his voice changed slightly. Less operational, more the voice of the person underneath the handler, who existed even if she didn't always get to see him. "The unauthorized transmitter, the Betamarsh communication channel, the equipment modification." "The formal reprimand," she said. "The formal reprimand." A pause. "It's in your file as of this morning." "I know." "It's also accompanied by a citation for actions that directly led to the recovery of 31 individuals and the identification of a corruption network operating through institutional access, which is in the same file on the same page." Another pause. "I just wanted you to know they're both there." "That's very tidy," she said. "I thought so." She ended the call and sat for another moment on the steps. The reprimand was fair. She had operated outside her authorization with personal equipment. She hadn't disclosed to her team in a way that had worked out but could have compromised the case at any of several points if the frequency had been detected by the network's surveillance apparatus before she'd used it. The citation was also fair. Both were accurate. The fact that they sat next to each other in the same file was not irony or contradiction. It was just the actual shape of the thing, which was that nothing she had done that night was simple or clean or entirely inside the lines, and it had mattered anyway. She thought about that, about the lines. She had spent 11 weeks inside a false identity, which meant she had spent 11 weeks doing her actual job while appearing to be someone who could be dismissed without consequence. A traveling nurse, a woman alone in a white van, the kind of person that certain men at a highway rest stop instinctively read as manageable, someone to be questioned, condescended to, handled, sent away, or held, depending on what was convenient. They had not been wrong about what she looked like. They had been catastrophically wrong about what that meant. And she had known the whole time that the gap between those two things was the only advantage she had. She hadn't been able to fight them on their terms. Their badges, their buildings, their radio frequencies, their network of institutional cover. She could only be what they'd already decided to see and wait and move when they weren't watching and do the work. There was something in that she hadn't quite articulated even to herself until now, sitting on federal building steps in October in her actual clothes. The work didn't care whether anyone was watching it. The 11 weeks of route mapping and documentation and careful, boring, painstaking information gathering had been invisible by design, and the invisibility hadn't made it less real. Greel and Kaur had spent 3 months watching a white van and deciding it was unremarkable. In doing so, they had watched Dara Voss build the case that ended them, in plain sight, because they'd already decided she wasn't worth the attention. That was the specific arrogance of certain kinds of power. The certainty that what you couldn't see immediately wasn't happening. She stood up. She had a meeting in Caldwell City on Thursday with the regional coordinator who was going to be her direct report in the new position, and she needed to spend the next 2 days reviewing the task force's existing files, which were incomplete in ways she'd already identified from the Harbor County case and was going to spend however long it took to fix. She also needed to call Bet Marsh, who was owed more than the professional courtesy she'd been operating on, and she needed to find a place to live in Caldwell City that wasn't a hotel, and she needed to sleep more than 4 hours on consecutive nights at least twice this week. None of those were dramatic things. They were just the next things, which was how the work went. The dramatic night followed by the long, unglamorous, necessary reconstruction. The case that was now in Adeline Swick's conference room in stacks of documents had started with Dara sitting in a parking lot writing notes in an encrypted file, and the next case was going to start the same way. And all the work between the starting and the ending was going to be exactly as invisible and exactly as real as it had always been. She walked down the steps to the sidewalk. She passed a man on a phone who didn't look up. She passed a woman with a stroller who was managing the stroller and a coffee and a tote bag simultaneously, with the particular focused competence of someone doing 3 things at once and not expecting anyone to notice. She passed a delivery driver carrying a box who nodded at her, and she nodded back. She looked like nobody specific, She always looked like nobody specific. She turned the corner and walked to her car, which was an unremarkable sedan with a federal plate she'd covered with a magnetic state plate from the cover vehicle inventory, because some habits, even the operational ones, took time to unlearn. She got in. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the interior. She thought about Priya Sen eating, about Tara Osei's 14 pages of statement, about an 8-year-old child in a cold room asking if she was a nurse, about Freya Holst, who was 32 years old and whose name was in every charging document and whose family had been told what could be told by victim services 2 weeks ago. She thought about a convoy of 2 sheriff's deputies at a highway rest stop and the specific quality of contempt in a man's voice when he told her someone like her had no place being somewhere like this, and how she'd sat with her hands visible and her face in the expression of a tired, unremarkable nurse, and said almost nothing because the work required it. Because the work was bigger than what she felt about the contempt, and the work was the point. It was always the point. She started the car. The road east to Caldwell City was open and straight and clear in the October light, and she drove it at a steady speed with the window cracked 2 inches and the cold air coming in, and the weight of everything that had happened 3 weeks ago sitting exactly where it was going to sit. Not heavier today than yesterday, not lighter, just present and real, and part of what she brought to the next thing. That was what the work asked for. Not the absence of what you carried, not the pretense of clean hands or clean outcomes, just the willingness to carry it honestly and keep going. She kept going. 41 miles later, she crossed the county line into Caldwell City, and the road signs changed and the landscape flattened, and somewhere in this city a 17-year-old girl was eating, and a family had their daughter back, and a task force was sitting in an incomplete state waiting for someone who knew what to look for. She had looked for it before in a white van in scrubs at midnight. She would look for it now in a building with a caseload and a team and a file system that needed rebuilding. Different shape. Same work, same work. She parked, got out, and walked toward the door. Nobody looked twice. That was perfectly fine.